August 13, 1829, marked the arrival of Charles E. Bowles into a world defined by the coarse grit of Norfolk, England, where the air tasted of salt and coal smoke, and the horizon promised nothing but labor. The infant who would one day haunt the stagecoaches of the Sierra Nevada was born not into crime, but into the stoic, unyielding stock of the working class, a demographic for whom survival was the only ambition. His father navigated a landscape of agricultural decline and industrial soot, a reality that imprinted upon young Charles the understanding that the earth yielded its treasures only to those willing to bleed for them. The family's migration to Jefferson County, New York, when Charles was merely a toddler, traded the gray skies of East Anglia for the hard, rocky soil of the American Northeast, a place where winters were long, cruel seasons of ice that hardened the ground as effectively as they hardened the men who worked it. The Bowles farm in New York was a proving ground for physical endurance, demanding 12-hour days of clearing stones, felling timber, and wresting crops from earth that seemed resentful of the plow. Charles grew into a frame that was lean but tensile, forged by the repetitive motion of the axe and the scythe, his hands developing thick calluses that would later grip the reins of a horse or the stock of a shotgun with equal familiarity. He was educated in the local schools, absorbing the literacy and refined mannerisms that would later distinguish him from the coarse ruffians of the frontier. But his true education lay in the observation of cause and effect in the natural world. He learned that hesitation resulted in injury, that a dull blade doubled the work, and that the only law that held absolute sway was the law of necessity. By 1849, the news of gold in California swept through Jefferson County like a fever, infecting the minds of men who had known only the slow, incremental gains of farming. Charles, alongside his brothers David and James, succumbed to the allure of the West, not out of greed, but out of a desperate desire to alter the trajectory of a life that seemed destined for mediocrity. They pooled their meager resources to outfit a wagon, purchasing oxen that looked sturdy enough to endure the 2,000 miles of hell that lay between the civilized world and the chaotic potential of the Pacific coast. The departure was a severance of ties, a stepping away from the predictable rhythms of the seasons into a linear journey toward an unknown abyss. The journey to Independence, Missouri was merely the preamble, a deceptively manageable trek that lulled them into a false sense of security before the true test began. Independence was a churning mire of mud, livestock, and humanity, a place where the air reeked of manure and unwashed bodies and where profiteers sold grain at extortionate rates to the waves of emigrants preparing to launch themselves onto the plains. The Bowles brothers joined a train, their wagon joining a long, snaking line of white canvas that looked from a distance like a fragile spine stretching across the vast green emptiness of the prairie. The early weeks were characterized by the sheer physical exertion of managing the oxen, the beasts requiring constant goading and guidance as they plodded through the deep ruts carved by the thousands who had gone before. As the convoy pushed further west, the environment turned hostile, the lush grasses giving way to the arid, sun-baked expanse of the Platte River Valley. The heat became a physical weight, pressing down on the oxen until their tongues lolled from their mouths, dripping thick saliva into the dust. Water became the currency of life, and the sources they found were often alkaline pools that sickened the animals and twisted the bowels of the men. Cholera stalked the wagon train, an invisible predator that struck without warning, turning healthy men into hollowed husks within hours. Charles watched as fellow travelers were buried in shallow graves alongside the trail, the earth barely covering their bodies before the wolves began to circle, their eyes reflecting the campfires in the dark. The terror of the cholera was compounded by the sheer monotony of the suffering, a daily grind of walking alongside the wagon in boots that disintegrated under the friction of the sand and stone. The stench of death was a constant companion, emanating from the bloated carcasses of oxen that had collapsed in the traces their bodies left to rot in the heat, creating a grim mile-marker system for those following behind. Charles learned to breathe through a cloth to filter out the dust that coated his lungs, a fine, alkaline powder that irritated the throat and made every breath a labor. He saw men abandon their most prized possessions, family heirlooms and heavy furniture tossed to the side of the trail to lighten the load for the failing draft animals, a litter of shattered dreams stretching all the way to the Rockies. Crossing the mountains was an exercise in freezing misery, the temperature plummeting at night until the water in their canteens turned to solid blocks of ice. The oxen, skeletal and exhausted, slipped on the treacherous paths, their hooves scrabbling for purchase on the granite, and every slip threatened to send the wagon and its precious cargo tumbling into the ravines below. Charles and his brothers spent days pushing the wheels, their shoulders bruised and raw, their breath pluming in the thin air as they fought gravity for every inch of elevation. It was here, in the high passes, that Charles realized the indifference of the wilderness. The mountains did not care if they lived or died, and survival was entirely dependent on their own refusal to quit. Arrival in California in late 1849 was not an entry into paradise, but a descent into a chaotic, lawless mud pit where civilization had been suspended. The gold fields were a festering wound on the landscape. The rivers churned into sludge by thousands of prospectors, the hillsides stripped of timber to build shanties and sluices. Charles and his brothers staked a claim, joining the legions of men who stood knee-deep in freezing water from dawn until dusk, their hands numb, their backs screaming in protest as they shoveled tons of gravel for a few flakes of yellow metal. The camp was a violent ecosystem where disputes were settled with knives and fists, and where the strong preyed upon the weak without hesitation or remorse. The labor was brutal, a relentless cycle of digging, washing, and searching, the physical toll manifesting in the loss of weight and the constant ache of joints exposed to the damp and the cold. Charles saw men lose their minds to the fever of the gold, their eyes taking on a manic glint as they dug frantically, ignoring hunger and hygiene in their pursuit of the mother lode. He witnessed the swift, brutal justice of the mining camps where thieves were hanged from the nearest oak branch without trial, their bodies swaying in the wind as a grim warning to others. This was a world where human life was valued less than a pouch of dust and where the veneer of Victorian morality was stripped away to reveal the primal animal beneath. Despite the hardships, the Bowles brothers managed to wrestle a modest profit from the earth, enough to justify the suffering, though the cost was etched into their faces and their spirits. They returned east in 1852 not as conquered men but as survivors who had stared into the void and returned. Charles, however, did not settle immediately. The restlessness of the frontier had infected his blood. He returned to California again in 1854, unable to resist the pull of the West, though this second expedition was less about the gold and more about the challenge of the land itself. He moved through the mining camps with the confidence of a veteran, a man who knew the sound of a rattlesnake and the look of a claim jumper, navigating the hazards with a cold, calculated precision. By the late 1850s, Charles had returned to Illinois, settling in Decatur, where he attempted to construct a facade of normalcy. He married Mary Elizabeth Johnson, a union that produced 4 children and anchored him to the community. He worked as a farmer, channeling his immense energy into the rows of corn and wheat, trying to find satisfaction in the slow, predictable cycle of agriculture. He became a father, a husband, a neighbor, playing the role of the respectable citizen, attending church and paying his taxes. Yet beneath the surface of this domestic tranquility, the memories of the high Sierra and the long trail burned, a dormant ember waiting for a wind to fan it back into flame. The nation itself was fracturing. the tension between North and South pulling at the seams of the society Charles had tried to integrate into. The rhetoric of war began to seep into Decatur, the newspapers filled with talk of secession and states' rights, of slavery and union. Charles listened to the arguments with the skepticism of a man who had seen the worst of human nature, knowing that war was not about glory or flags, but about blood and mud and the destruction of order. He watched as young men, boys really, marched in the streets with wooden rifles, their faces shining with a naive patriotism that made his stomach turn. He knew what lay ahead for them, the dysentery and the amputation saws, the shallow graves and the letters home that would never be sent. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln signaled the end of the uneasy peace, and the country began its slide toward the precipice. Charles continued to work his land, the rhythm of his hoe striking the earth serving as a counterpoint to the drums of war beating in the distance. He looked at his children, at the life he had built, and felt the fragility of it all, the knowledge that everything could be swept away by forces beyond his control. The harsh lessons of the Oregon Trail and the gold camps had taught him that stability was an illusion, a temporary state of grace that could be shattered by a single loose rock or a sudden frost. When the war finally erupted in 1861, it was not a surprise to Charles, but a confirmation of the world's inherent chaos. He saw the recruitment posters go up, the flags unfurl, and the community of Decatur mobilize for conflict. At 32 years of age, he was older than the average recruit, a man with a family and a farm to protect. Yet he felt the pull of duty, or perhaps the pull of the inevitable. He understood that this conflict would define the future of the nation, and by extension, the future of his own children. The iron that had been forged in the fires of his youth was about to be tested in a furnace far hotter than any he had yet encountered. The decision to enlist was not made lightly. It was a calculated choice, weighed against the needs of his family and the risks of the battlefield. He looked at Mary, saw the fear in her eyes, and knew that leaving was a betrayal of their domestic pact. Yet staying felt like a denial of the reality that was consuming the country. He walked into the recruitment office not as a boy seeking adventure, but as a man accepting a burden, his signature on the enlistment papers a contract with death. He was assigned to the 116th Illinois Infantry, a regiment composed of men from his own region, farmers and shopkeepers who would soon be transformed into killers and corpses. As 1861 drew to a close, Charles prepared to leave the sanctuary of Decatur. He packed his kit with the efficiency of an old campaigner, checking his boots, his blanket, his razor. He said his goodbyes with a stoicism that masked the turmoil within, holding his children for a moment longer than usual, memorizing the scent of their hair and the weight of their small bodies. He walked away from his farm, the fields lying fallow under the winter sky, and marched toward the assembly point, the sound of his boots on the frozen road echoing the departure he had made 12 years prior. The training camps were a return to the primitive conditions he knew well, the tents flapping in the wind, the food barely edible, the discipline harsh and arbitrary. Charles adapted quickly, his previous experience on the frontier giving him an advantage over the raw recruits who struggled with the hardships of bivouac life. He learned the manual of arms, the intricate dance of loading and firing the musket, the complex maneuvers of the company front. He watched as the officers, often political appointees with no military experience, fumbled with commands, and he quietly noted who among them was competent and who was a liability. He saw the sickness return, the measles and the typhoid sweeping through the barracks, claiming lives before a single shot was fired. He watched men cough their lungs out in the infirmary, their dreams of glory dissolving in a fevered delirium. He kept his own counsel, washing his hands, boiling his water, tending to his gear with a religious devotion. He knew that in the chaos that was to come, his rifle would be his only true friend, and he treated it with the respect due a lifeline. The year ended with the regiment still in training, poised on the edge of the violence that would consume them. Charles wrote letters home, his handwriting neat and controlled, describing the boredom and the drills, omitting the fear and the filth. He created a narrative for his wife that shielded her from the reality of his existence, a skill that would serve him well in the years to come. He was a soldier now, a cog in the vast machine of the Union Army, but inside, the heart of the individualist still beat, watching, assessing, preparing. The transition from the civilian Charles Bowles to the soldier of the 116th was a shedding of skin, a stripping away of the soft layers of civilization to reveal the hard, unyielding core beneath. The winter of 1861 was cold, but it was nothing compared to the chill that was settling into his soul. He stood guard duty in the sleet, staring into the darkness, knowing that the man he had been was gone, replaced by something sharper, deadlier, and infinitely more alone. The roots of iron had taken hold, anchoring him against the storm, but the tree that would grow from them would be twisted by the winds of war, bearing fruit that was bitter and strange. The humid air of the Mississippi Delta in late 1862 was a physical barrier, a thick wall of moisture that carried the scent of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. Charles Bowles, now fully integrated into the machinery of the 116th Illinois Infantry, found himself navigating a landscape that seemed designed by a malevolent hand to destroy human life before a single enemy soldier could be engaged. The regiment moved south, not in a glorious charge, but in a slow, grinding procession of steamboats and muddy marches descending into the heart of the Confederacy. The river was a brown, churning artery that carried them deeper into a hostility that radiated from the very banks where snipers concealed in the cypress trees waited to pick off the careless. Bowles watched the water slide past, thick with debris and the occasional bloated carcass of a mule, understanding that the war was not merely a conflict of armies but a struggle against the environment itself. December of 1862 brought the reality of combat at Chickasaw Bayou, a chaotic, fumbling engagement where the Union forces were thrown against entrenched Confederate positions protected by swamps and abatis. Bowles stood in the line, the weight of his musket familiar now, the woodstock slick with the sweat of his palms. The order to advance sent them plunging into water that reached their waists, a slurry of mud and slime that sucked at their boots and slowed their momentum to a crawl. The air above them snapped with the sound of passing projectiles, the mini balls tearing through the foliage with a noise like ripping canvas. Men on either side of him stumbled and fell, splashing into the murky water, the dark red of their blood instantly diluting into the brown filth. There was no grandeur in it, only the mechanical necessity of keeping the powder dry and moving forward while the world exploded around them. The defeat at Chickasaw Bayou was a harsh lesson in the futility of frontal assaults against fortified terrain, teaching Bowles that courage was often a poor substitute for tactical advantage. The retreat was a somber affair, the men shivering in their wet wool uniforms, their morale sapped by the cold rain that began to fall. They huddled in makeshift camps, scraping the mud from their skin, listening to the groans of the wounded who waited for the surgeons. Bowles cleaned his rifle with a meticulous intensity, removing every speck of grit from the lock mechanism, knowing that a jammed weapon meant death. He observed the officers debating their next move, their voices raised in frustration, and realized that the chain of command was as fallible as the iron sights on his gun. In January of 1863, the regiment was thrown into the assault on Arkansas Post, a fortification on the Arkansas River that guarded the approach to Little Rock. This time, the coordination was better, the gunboats pounding the earthen walls before the infantry swept forward. Bowles moved with his company, the ground shaking under the impact of the naval artillery, the smoke from the cannons rolling over the field in dense, acrid clouds. They overran the rifle pits, engaging in close-quarters brutality that reduced warfare to its most primitive state. Bowles saw men clubbing each other with muskets, using bayonets with grim efficiency, the veneer of civilization stripping away entirely. When the white flag finally rose over the fort, the scene inside was a charnel house of shattered timber and mangled bodies, the defenders looking hollow-eyed and shell-shocked. The capture of Arkansas Post was a victory, but it was merely a prelude to the long, agonizing campaign against Vicksburg. The army moved back down the river, settling into the mud of Young's Point and Milliken's Bend, where they spent the winter and spring trying to find a way around the Confederate Gibraltar. This period was a test of endurance rather than combat, a war against boredom and disease. The camps were miserable collections of tents pitched on levees, the only dry ground available in a flooded landscape. Dysentery and malaria rampaged through the ranks, claiming more lives than the Confederate artillery. Bowles watched as strong men withered away, their bodies consumed by fevers that defied the limited medical knowledge of the regimental doctors. He drank his coffee black and bitter, ate the hardtack that was often infested with weevils, and kept his feet dry whenever possible, adhering to the survival protocols he had learned on the trail to California. Spring brought the daring maneuver to cross the river below Vicksburg, a gamble that paid off and set the army on a relentless march through the interior of Mississippi. The battles of Raymond, Jackson, and Champion Hill followed in rapid succession, a whirlwind of marching and fighting that pushed the men to the limits of their physical capacity. Bowles marched until his feet blistered and bled, his uniform stiff with sweat and dust, his mind narrowing to the singular focus of putting one foot in front of the other. At Champion Hill, the fighting was ferocious, the lines swaying back and forth over the crest of a ridge, the air thick with the smoke of thousands of discharges. Bowles fired until his shoulder was bruised purple from the recoil, his face blackened by powder residue, his ears ringing with the constant roar of the volleys. The siege of Vicksburg began in late May, a 47-day stranglehold that turned the war into a contest of engineering and starvation. The regiment dug in, constructing a labyrinth of trenches and rifle pits that inched closer to the Confederate lines with each passing night. The heat was oppressive, the sun baking the clay soil until it was hard as brick, reflecting the temperature back onto the men who cowered in the ditches. Bowles spent his days and nights in the dirt, sniping at any movement on the enemy parapets, living like a troglodyte in a hole carved from the earth. The constant proximity to death, the daily mortar fire that rained down indiscriminately, created a fatalistic atmosphere where survival seemed entirely random. He watched the city of Vicksburg crumble under the bombardment, the civilian houses reduced to rubble, the inhabitants forced to live in caves dug into the hillsides. When Vicksburg finally surrendered on July 4, 1863, the victory was absolute, but the celebration was muted by exhaustion. The regiment marched into the city, passing the emaciated defenders who stacked their arms in silent resignation. Bowles looked at the faces of the enemy and saw the same gaunt, hollow look that mirrored his own. There was no hatred in that moment, only a shared recognition of the horror they had both endured. The river was open, the Confederacy cut in two, but the war was far from over. The 116th was soon on the move again, transferred to the Chattanooga campaign, where they stormed the heights of Missionary Ridge in a display of sheer audacity that broke the Confederate line and opened the gateway to the Deep South. The year 1864 saw Bowles promoted, his competence and survival instinct recognized by his superiors. He became a first sergeant and later a second lieutenant, positions that placed the burden of command squarely on his shoulders. He was no longer just responsible for his own skin, he was responsible for the lives of the men under him, a heavy weight that added a new layer of grim determination to his character. The Atlanta campaign was a relentless grind of flanking maneuvers and sharp skirmishes, pushing the enemy back mile by mile toward the critical rail hub. Bowles led his men through the dense pine forests of Georgia, navigating the ambushes and the fortified lines, his eyes always scanning the terrain for the telltale glint of a rifle barrel. The capture of Atlanta was the turning point, the moment when General Sherman decided to abandon his supply lines and march to the sea, cutting a swath of destruction through the heart of the enemy territory. The 116th was part of this great raid, a 60-mile-wide column of destruction that moved with the inexorable force of a natural disaster. Bowles witnessed the total war doctrine in practice, a systematic dismantling of the enemy's ability to wage war. They tore up the railroads, heating the iron rails over bonfires of ties and twisting them around trees until they were useless metal pretzels. They confiscated livestock, grain, and fodder, leaving the plantations bare and the civilians destitute. This phase of the war was different. It was personal and vindictive. The bummers, the foragers who ranged ahead of the columns, often engaged in looting and violence that went beyond military necessity. Bowles saw the grand houses of the plantation aristocracy go up in flames, the smoke columns marking the army's progress, for miles. He saw the fear in the eyes of the women and children who watched their world turn to ash. And while he did not participate in the wanton cruelty, he did nothing to stop it. He understood the logic of the generals. To end the war, they had to break the will of the Southern people, and that meant bringing the pain of the conflict to their doorsteps. The brutality was a tool, a lever to pry the enemy into submission, and Bowles applied it with the cold detachment of a professional. The march through the swamps of the Carolinas in early 1865 was a feat of logistics that rivaled the crossing of the Alps. The army built corduroy roads through the muck, cutting down entire forests to pave a path for the artillery and the wagons. Bowles waded through the freezing water, often waist-deep, urging his men forward when they wanted to lie down and quit. The resistance was sporadic but desperate, the retreating Confederates burning bridges and poisoning wells in a futile attempt to slow the juggernaut. The destruction of Columbia, South Carolina was the apex of the firestorm, a night where the city burned from end to end, the flames leaping from roof to roof driven by a high wind, and the rage of the soldiers who blamed the state for starting the rebellion. Bowles walked through the burning streets, the heat singing his eyebrows, the air filled with the roar of the inferno and the screams of the displaced. By the time the army reached North Carolina and forced the surrender of General Johnston, the war had carved a hollow space inside Charles Bowles. He had seen the best and worst of humanity, the acts of selfless heroism and the depths of depravity. He had learned that civilization was a fragile construct, easily dismantled by the application of force, and that the only thing that protected a man and his property was his ability to defend it. The grand ideals of the Union and the Constitution were abstract concepts. The reality was the mud, the blood, and the ruins of a society that had believed itself invincible. The Grand Review in Washington, D.C. in May of 1865 was a spectacle of triumph, the armies marching down Pennsylvania Avenue amidst cheering crowds and waving flags. Bowles marched with his company, his uniform brushed, his boots polished, his face set in a mask of discipline. He looked at the politicians and the civilians on the reviewing stands, safe and clean in their fine clothes, and felt a profound disconnect. They cheered the victory, but they did not know the cost. They had not smelled the gangrene or heard the sound of a man drowning in his own blood. He was a hero to them, but to himself he was a survivor. A man who had walked through the fire and come out the other side tempered and hardened. He mustered out on June 7, 1865, receiving his final pay and his discharge papers. He handed in his rifle, the weapon that had been his constant companion for 3 years, and walked away from the army a civilian once more. But the Charles Bowles who returned to Illinois was not the same man who had left. The farmer was gone, replaced by a man who had tasted the absolute freedom of the outlaw forager and the absolute authority of the officer. He had seen the wealth of the South redistributed at the point of a bayonet, seen the powerful brought low and the weak trampled. He returned to his family, to the wife and children who had waited for him. But the quiet life of the farm felt alien and constricting. The silence of the fields was too loud after the roar of the cannon, and the slow pace of the season seemed agonizingly dull. The war had taught him that rules were for those who could not make their own, that power resided in action, and that the world owed nothing to anyone. He tried to settle back into the domestic routine, to pick up the threads of his former life, but the fabric was frayed. The call of the West, the memory of the gold camps began to whisper to him again, promising a different kind of freedom, a place where a man with his skills and his hardness could carve out a destiny on his own terms. The furnace of war had burned away the dross, leaving only the iron, and the iron was restless, seeking a new purpose, a new struggle. The scars of the conflict were not just on his body but on his psyche. He carried the images of the burning cities and the starving civilians, the knowledge of how easily the strong could take from the weak. This knowledge sat in the back of his mind, a cold, hard lump of truth that made it difficult to respect the petty laws and social conventions of peacetime society. He looked at the bankers and the merchants, the men who had stayed behind and profited while he bled, and felt a simmering resentment. They spoke of justice and order, but he knew that justice was often just a word used by the powerful to legitimize their theft. As the months passed, the restlessness grew, a physical itch that could not be scratched by plowing fields or mending fences. The West beckoned with its open spaces and its lack of history, a place where a man could reinvent himself, where the past could be buried under the vastness of the landscape. Charles Bowles began to look west again, his eyes turning toward the setting sun, toward the mountains where he had once sought gold and where he would soon seek something else entirely. The soldier was retiring, but the strategist, the survivor, the man who knew how to wait and how to strike, was just beginning to awaken. The war had ended, but for Charles Bowles, the peace was just an interlude before the next campaign. 1867 opened with a silence that hung heavy over the Bowles homestead in Decatur. A stillness born of a decision that had already been made in the quiet, tortured hours before dawn. Charles Bowles stood at the precipice of his second great departure. A man of 49 years staring down the barrel of a middle age that offered him nothing but the slow, corrosive decline of a debt-ridden farmer. The war had ended 2 years prior, but the peace had brought no prosperity, only a restless churning in his gut that soured his food and made the walls of his house feel like the sides of a coffin. He looked at Mary Elizabeth, his wife, and saw the lines of worry etched into her face. Lines he had put there with his wanderlust and his inability to find contentment in the furrowed earth of Illinois. He told her he was going west again, not for adventure this time, but for salvation, to find the strike that would secure their future and erase the lean years that stretched behind them like a hungry shadow. He left in the spring, turning his back on the budding trees and the wet black soil, boarding a train that would carry him to the edge of the frontier. The journey was different from the wagon train of 49. The iron horse devoured the miles with a mechanical indifference, the landscape blurring past the windows in a streak of green and brown. He arrived in Montana Territory, a raw, untamed land that made the California of his youth seem almost civilized by comparison. The gold camps here were sores on the landscape, hastily erected shanties of pine and canvas that huddled in the gulches, populated by men who had washed up on the shores of society like driftwood. Bowles made his way to the solitary, freezing expanses near Silver Bow, staking a claim in a region where the wind cut through wool coats as if they were made of gauze. The mining here was not the pan-washing of the early days. It was a brutal industrial effort requiring ditches, flumes, and the diversion of entire creeks to wash away the overburden. Bowles partnered with men who were as hard and desperate as himself, forming a grim fraternity bound by the shared misery of the labor. They spent their days waist-deep in water that was barely above freezing, their hands turning blue and clumsy as they wrestled with rocks the size of anvils. The food was a monotonous rotation of beans, salt pork, and bread that froze solid if left away from the fire, requiring them to hack off chunks with a knife before softening it in their coffee. Scurvy was a constant threat, the lack of fresh vegetables loosening their teeth and turning their gums into bleeding sponges. Winter in Montana was a siege event, a white curtain dropping over the world that isolated them from everything but the howling wind. The snow piled up in drifts 10 feet deep, burying the cabins and forcing them to dig tunnels just to reach the woodpile. Bowles lay in his bunk at night listening to the timber groan under, the weight of the ice, his body aching from the damp that seeped into his bones. He thought of his family in Decatur, of the warmth of the hearth he had abandoned, and the guilt was a cold stone in his stomach. He wrote letters home, carefully constructing a fiction of steady progress and imminent wealth, hiding the reality of the empty sluice boxes and the gnawing hunger. He could not admit failure, not after leaving them a second time. Pride was the only coat he had left to wear against the cold. By 1868, the small operations were being squeezed by the arrival of larger capital-backed enterprises. These companies brought with them the machinery of the industrial East, hydraulic monitors that blasted the hillsides with jets of water powerful enough to kill a man instantly. They also brought lawyers and agents, men who fought with paper and ink rather than pickaxes. Bowles and his partners had moved to a new claim near the Big Hole River, investing their last reserves of strength and money into digging a long ditch to bring water to their dry placers. The ditch was their lifeline, a shallow trench carved by hand through the frozen earth, representing months of back-breaking labor. Without the water, the gold locked in the gravel was unreachable, a tantalizing promise that would remain forever buried. It was here, in the high, thin air of the Rockies, that the hammer blow fell, not from the elements but from the institution that would become the architect of his rage. Agents representing the interests of Wells Fargo and Company had moved into the territory, acquiring water rights and squeezing out the independent miners to consolidate their holdings. They viewed men like Bowles not as pioneers but as obstacles, remnants of a chaotic past that needed to be swept away for the sake of efficiency and profit. The confrontation did not happen with guns drawn in the street, but with the dull, bureaucratic finality of a court order enforced by hired muscle. Bowles arrived at his ditch one morning to find the flow of water stopped, the trench dry and cracking in the sun. Men employed by the company stood guard at the diversion point, armed with Winchesters and the arrogance of those who have the law in their pocket. They told him the water rights had been purchased, that his claim was now subordinate to the company's needs, and that he was trespassing on their infrastructure. Bowles stood there, his shovel in his hand, looking at the water that should have been flowing to his claim, watching it diverted into the flumes of the corporate mine down the valley. The injustice of it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had followed the rules, he had done the work, and yet the prize was snatched away by men who had never lifted a rock in their lives. He tried to fight it, exhausting his meager savings on legal fees, pleading his case before judges who dined with the company superintendents. He was met with stone walls and patronizing dismissals, told that progress required sacrifice and that the rights of the corporation superseded the rights of the individual squatter. The realization dawned on him slowly, then with a terrifying clarity. The system was rigged. The law was not a shield for the weak, but a weapon for the strong. Wells Fargo was not just a bank or a shipping company, it was a predator, a hydra that devoured the labor of men like him and excreted profit for shareholders in San Francisco and New York. The loss of the water ruined him. The claim, worthless without the ability to wash the gravel, had to be abandoned. The months of digging, the freezing nights, the starvation. It had all been for nothing. Bowles watched his partners drift away, broken men looking for a bottle or a rope. But within him, something else began to crystallize. The iron that had been tempered in the Civil War now hardened into a cold, brittle hatred. He did not blame the water or the gold or the land. He blamed the entity that had stolen his livelihood. Wells Fargo became the focus of his animosity, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the new America emerging from the ashes of the war. He drifted for the next 2 years, moving through Idaho and back toward California, a ghost haunting the edges of the mining districts. He took odd jobs, working as a clerk or a laborer, but his mind was always turning, replaying the moment at the ditch, the sneer of the company guard. He saw the Wells Fargo stagecoaches thundering along the dusty roads, the drivers sitting high on the box, the strong boxes filled with gold dust. Dust that had been dug by men like him, stolen by the company through fees and water rights and exorbitant shipping rates. The green boxes with the gold lettering were no longer just transport. They were chariots of theft, parading their spoils in front of the victims. In 1871, he wrote his final letter to Mary Elizabeth from the mining camp of Helena. It was a masterpiece of omission, a goodbye that masqueraded as a pause. He told her that he was on to something big, that he couldn't return just yet, that he needed a little more time to secure their fortune. In reality, he was severing the tether. He knew he could not go back to Decatur as a failure, a man who had been beaten by the world. To return empty-handed was a death of the soul he could not endure. He chose instead to disappear, to let Charles Bowles the farmer fade away, leaving room for the entity that was slowly taking shape in the dark corners of his mind. He ceased communication, allowing the silence to stretch into months, then years. To his family, he was likely dead, a casualty of the harsh frontier, perhaps buried in a slide or scalped by Indians. But Bowles was very much alive, refining his skills, observing the patterns of the stage lines, studying the terrain with the eye of a topographic engineer. He walked the roads of Northern California, not as a traveler, but as a scout behind enemy lines. He noted where the coaches slowed down on the steep grades, where the brush grew thickest near the road, where the escape routes led into the impenetrable chaparral. He began to cultivate a new appearance, shedding the rough wool and denim of the miner for the linen duster and the bowler hat of a gentleman. It was a disguise that allowed him to move invisible through the towns, a camouflage of respectability that deflected suspicion. He watched the drivers change horses at the way stations, listening to their talk, learning their schedules, their fears, and their habits. He learned that the shotgun messengers were often more bluster than bite, that the drivers were concerned primarily with the safety of their teams, and that the passengers were sheep who would comply with any authority that asserted itself. The transformation was internal as well as external. He suppressed the rage, packing it down into a tight, dense core of purpose. He was not going to be a common ruffian, a drunken bandit waving a pistol and shouting curses. He would be an instrument of retribution, a phantom that struck at the company's bottom line. He decided that he would not kill. Killing brought the heat of the law and the revulsion of the public. He wanted to humiliate Wells Fargo, to show that their power could be challenged by a single man with a plan and the will to execute it. His war would be surgical, a series of precise incisions that bled the beast without slaying it, ensuring that the terror lasted as long as possible. He spent the latter part of 1871 wandering the Sierra foothills, testing his endurance. He found that even at 52 he could outwalk men half his age. His legs were cords of muscle, his lungs adapted to the thin air. He slept on the ground, wrapped in a single blanket, eating dried meat and crackers, needing no fire, leaving no trace. He became a part of the landscape, a shadow that moved with the sun. He practiced his voice, lowering it into a deep, resonant register that carried authority without shouting. He tested the shotgun he had acquired, an old double-barreled weapon, not to fire it, but to gauge its weight, its balance, how it looked from the business end. The final piece of the puzzle was the location. He needed a place where the isolation was absolute, where the terrain favored the ambusher. He scouted the road between Copperopolis and Milton, a stretch of dust and rock that wound through the low hills far from the telegraph wires and the sheriff's office. It was a lonely, desolate place, perfect for a private conversation between a man and a corporation. He walked the route multiple times, memorizing every turn, every rock, every scrub oak. He found a spot near the crest of a hill where the horses would be winded, where the driver would be focused on the reins, where the brush grew close to the wheel tracks. As the year drew to a close, Charles Bowles stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, the sun setting behind him, casting a long shadow that stretched toward the east. He was alone, truly alone in a way he had never been before. He had no home, no family he could claim, no name that meant anything in this new world. He was a non-entity, a ghost in the machine. But he had a purpose now, a mission that burned brighter than any gold fever. He would take back what had been stolen, not just the money, but the dignity, the agency, the right to exist on his own terms. The theft of the water had been the catalyst, the spark that ignited the fuse. The explosion was yet to come, but the charge was set, and the timer was ticking. He descended from the ridge as the twilight deepened, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He checked his pockets, ensuring he had the flour sack with the eye holes cut out, the loose linen duster, the shotgun. He was ready. The farmer from Decatur was dead, buried in the mud of the Montana ditch. The man walking down the hill was something else entirely, a construct of grievance and discipline, heading toward a destiny that would be written in the dust of the stagecoach road. The loose thread that would eventually unravel him was years in the future. For now, the weave was tight, the pattern set, and the grim theater of his revenge was about to raise its curtain. The sun hanging over the Sierra foothills on July 26, 1875, was not a celestial body but a physical weight, pressing down on the landscape with a malice that bleached the color from the grass and turned the earth into a kiln. John Shine sat on the box of the Concord stagecoach, his body absorbing every jolt and shudder of the vehicle as it navigated the Reynolds Ferry Road between Copperopolis and Milton. The heat was absolute, a shimmering wall that distorted the horizon and cooked the air until it tasted of dust and scorched sage. Shine wiped a sleeve across his forehead, the sweat mixing with the road grit to form a gray paste that stung his eyes, blurring his vision of the trail ahead. He was a veteran driver, a man whose hands were permanently shaped to the curve of the leather reins, but even he found the oppression of this particular afternoon to be a test of endurance. The 6 horses pulling the coach were coated in a lather of white foam, their flanks heaving with the effort of dragging the heavy vehicle up the long, steep grade that separated the mining camps from the railhead. The road was a narrow scar cut into the side of the hill, flanked on one side by a steep embankment rising into the chaparral and on the other by a drop-off into the dry ravines below. The coach, a lumbering beast of oak and iron, groaned under the strain, the thorough braces, thick leather straps that acted as suspension, creaking rhythmically like the breathing of a tired animal. Shine kept a light tension on the lines, feeling the mouths of the leaders, sensing their fatigue. He knew the route by heart, every pothole, every washout, every rock that could shatter a wheel rim. It was a job of constant low-level anxiety, where a moment of inattention could result in a wreck that would kill the horses and maim the passengers huddled inside the sweltering cabin. Today, the passenger list was light, a few travelers enduring the misery of the journey. For business or family, their conversations stifled by the noise of the wheels and the overwhelming temperature. As the team crested the summit of the grade, the horses slowed to a walk, their heads bobbing with the exertion. Shine reached for the brake lever, a long iron bar on the right side of the box, preparing to ease the coach down the other side. The silence of the wilderness was profound, broken only by the snort of a wheeler horse and the crunch of iron tires on gravel. The scrub oak and manzanita grew thick here, crowding the edge of the road, creating a tunnel of vegetation that offered ambush points every 10 yards. Shine scanned the brush from habit rather than genuine fear. The road had been quiet for months, the era of the great highwaymen seemingly fading into history. He was thinking of the cold beer waiting for him in Milton, of the water trough for the horses, of the simple pleasure of standing on solid ground. Then the bush on the left side of the road exploded, not with fire, but with a presence. A figure stepped from the shadows of the manzanita, moving with a fluid, deliberate speed that froze Shine's heart in his chest. The man was a specter, a nightmare manifestation of the frontier's dark underbelly. He stood directly in front of the lead horses, causing them to rear back in panic, their hooves scrabbling for purchase on the loose stones. Shine fought the reins, shouting to the team, his boots slamming against the footboard to brace himself. The figure did not flinch at the 1,000 pounds of horseflesh flailing inches from his face. He stood his ground, a statue of menace planted in the center of the thoroughfare. The appearance of the highwayman was calculated to induce terror. He wore a long linen duster that fell to his ankles, concealing the shape of his body and any weapons he might be carrying on his belt. But it was the head that commanded attention. A flour sack, coarse and white, had been pulled over his head, the corners, tied to create a crude hood. 2 round holes had been cut for the eyes, dark pits that revealed nothing of the man beneath, giving him the appearance of a hollow-eyed ghoul. He held a double-barreled shotgun in his hands, the stock nestled against his shoulder, the twin muzzles leveled directly at Shine's chest. The bores of the gun looked like 2 black tunnels to eternity, steady and unmoving. Shine froze, his hands gripping the reins so hard his knuckles turned white. The adrenaline dump was instantaneous, a cold wash that started at the base of his spine and flooded his limbs, making his fingers tingle. He knew the physics of the shotgun. At this range, the spread of the buckshot would not just kill him, it would erase him. It would tear his torso apart, turning his lungs and heart into a red mist that would coat the passengers behind him. The horses, sensing the tension and the obstacle, danced nervously, the harness jingling, but the man in the mask made a low, calming sound. That seemed to check them more effectively than Shine's own hands. Then the voice came, and it was not the shout of a desperate, meth-addled ruffian, but a deep, resonant command that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "Throw down the box," the figure said. The tone was hollow, muffled slightly by the flour sack, but it carried an authority that brooked no argument. It was the voice of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed, a man who had stripped away all uncertainty. Shine looked at the shotgun, then at the masked face. He saw no tremor in the hands holding the weapon, no sign of the nervous energy that usually accompanied a robbery. This was a professional transaction, conducted with the cold efficiency of a butcher. Shine hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind racing through the company protocols, the vague instructions about protecting the cargo. But the reality of the 12-gauge shotgun overrode all corporate loyalty. He looked down at the boot of the stagecoach where the Wells Fargo strongbox sat, a heavy green chest reinforced with iron bands. It contained gold dust, coin, and registered mail, the lifeblood of the local economy, the fruit of 1,000 hours of labor by men in the mines. In that moment, it was just metal and paper. His life was the only currency that had value. "Throw it down," the voice repeated, sharper this time, the barrels of the shotgun tracking upward slightly, aiming for Shine's face. The threat was explicit. The bandit was not asking, he was offering a choice between compliance and execution. Shine reached down, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, grabbing the iron handle of the strongbox. It was heavy, dead weight, and he had to use both hands to hoist it over the lip of the footboard. He heaved it into the air, watching it arc downward. The box hit the dusty road with a dull, heavy thud, kicking up a small cloud of grit. The sound was final, the sound of surrender. The highwayman did not look at the box. His gaze remained fixed on Shine, the shotgun never wavering. He knew that the driver carried a pistol, that there might be weapons inside the coach. He was controlling the space, dominating the encounter through sheer force of will. He then did something that chilled Shine even more than the gun. He turned his head slightly toward the brush on the hillside, as if communicating with unseen accomplices. "If he dares to shoot, give him a volley, boys," the bandit shouted over his shoulder. The words were directed at the empty chaparral, but to Shine, in his state of heightened panic, the bushes seemed to bristle with hidden rifles. He imagined a dozen eyes sighting down barrels, fingers tightening on triggers, waiting for him to make a mistake. The passengers inside the coach were silent, frozen in their seats. They had heard the commotion, the shouting, the thud of the box. They knew that their lives hung by a thread, that any sudden movement could turn the coach into a coffin. A woman stifled a sob, the sound small and pathetic in the vast silence of the heat. The bandit turned back to Shine, the eye holes of the mask fixing him with a stare that felt physical. "That will be all," he said, the politeness of the phrase jarring against the violence of the situation. "Drive on." Shine did not wait for a second invitation. He cracked the whip, the sound like a pistol shot in the stillness, and shouted to the horses. The team, eager to escape the strange figure and the tension, surged forward, their hooves tearing at the road surface. The coach lurched into motion, the wheels grinding past the fallen strongbox. Shine kept his back rigid, his muscles locked in a spasm of expectation. He waited for the impact, for the burning sensation of a slug entering his spine. Every second that passed without a gunshot felt like a miracle. He did not look back. He drove with a manic intensity, urging the horses into a gallop that was dangerous on the winding road, but he didn't care. He wanted distance. He wanted to put miles between himself and the ghost in the linen duster. The descent into Reynolds Ferry was a blur of dust and speed. Shine's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding of the hooves. He replayed the scene in his mind. The image of the flour sack mask burned into his retinas. The isolation of the robbery site terrified him. They had been completely alone, miles from help, at the mercy of a man who had turned the road into his own private kingdom. The deception of the hidden gang in the bushes played over and over in his thoughts. He was convinced he had escaped a massacre, that only his compliance had saved the passengers from being cut to pieces by a fusillade from the hillside. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Milton, the horses were blown, their sides heaving, foam dripping from their bits. Shine hauled on the brake lever, bringing the vehicle to a screeching halt in front of the depot. He climbed down from the box, his legs shaking so badly he nearly collapsed in the dust. The station agent came out, expecting the usual routine of unloading mail and baggage, but stopped when he saw Shine's face. The driver was pale, his eyes wide and wild, the sweat on his face cold and clammy despite the heat. "He got it," Shine gasped, his voice raspy and thin. "He got the box." The words tumbled out, an incoherent stream of description and fear. He told them about the man in the mask, the deep voice, the shotgun that looked like a cannon. He told them about the gang in the bushes, the boys waiting to open fire. The town of Milton, sleepy and slow in the afternoon sun, was galvanized by the news. Men grabbed rifles and ran into the street, shouting questions, demanding details. The telegraph wires began to hum, sending the message to San Andreas and Stockton. The stage had been robbed. Shine sat on a bench in the station office, a cup of water trembling in his hand. He felt a profound sense of violation. The road which had been his workplace, his domain, had been taken from him. It was no longer a path of commerce. It was a trap. The bandit had not just stolen gold. He had stolen the illusion of safety. Shine knew that every time he drove that route again, every time he saw a bush rustle or a shadow lengthen across the trail, he would see the eye holes of that mask. The psychological wound was deep and immediate. He had been unmanned, forced to bow before a superior force, forced to participate in the theft of the property he was sworn to protect. The local law enforcement, such as it was, organized a posse within the hour. They rode out toward Reynolds Ferry, their horses kicking up dust, their faces grim. They were looking for a gang, for a group of armed desperados who had brazenly attacked the company's stage. They expected a track of many horses, a campsite, signs of a large force. Shine watched them go, feeling a mixture of hope and skepticism. The man he had faced didn't seem like the type to be caught by a group of town merchants and farmers. There was a calculation in that hollow voice, a cold intelligence that suggested the bandit was already miles away, vanishing into the terrain he seemed to know so well. Back at the scene of the crime, the silence had returned. The dust settled on the road, covering the tracks of the stagecoach. The strongbox was gone, pried open and emptied, left as a husk in the brush. The boys in the bushes remained silent, for they had never existed. The sticks, propped up to look like rifle barrels if there were any, stood guard over nothing. The bandit had played the role of a general commanding an army, and Shine had been the unwitting audience for the first act of a performance that would captivate the state for years. Shine remained in Milton that night, unable to bring himself to get back on the box. He drank whiskey to dull the edge of the memory, but the alcohol couldn't wash away the image of the shotgun barrels. He described the encounter to anyone who would listen, and with each retelling the bandit grew larger, the voice deeper, the danger more acute lead. He spoke of the deep, hollow voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. He emphasized the politeness, the pleas, and the drive on, which somehow made the threat more terrifying than if the man had cursed and screamed. It implied a control that was unnatural in a criminal. The robbery on the Sonora Road was not just a theft, it was a statement. It was the introduction of a new variable into the equation of the West. The chaotic, bloody violence of the post-Civil War era was evolving into something more refined, more theatrical. Shine, in his terror, had been the first to witness the birth of the persona that would soon be known as Black Bart. He didn't know the name yet, no one did, but he knew the feeling of being in the presence of a predator who viewed humans as sheep to be sheared. The sun set over the Central Valley, turning the sky a bruised purple. Shine lay in a rented room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the window pane. He thought about the vulnerability of the stagecoach, a wooden box moving through a wilderness that belonged to the wolf and the bear, and now, the man in the flour sack mask. He realized that the rules had changed. The road was no longer a line on a map. It was a gauntlet. And he, John Shine, was the man who had to run it day after day. Knowing that the devil was waiting in the chaparral, watching with eyes that were nothing but black holes in a white face. The physical reality of the event began to settle in as the shock wore off. His arms ached from the strain of holding the team. His throat was raw from the dust, and his mind was exhausted from the cycle of fear and relief. He realized he had never seen the man's hands, only the gloves. He had never seen the boots, only the duster. The bandit had been an entity, without features, a blank canvas onto which Shine had projected his own worst fears. This lack of detail was what made it so haunting. A man with a scar or a beard could be identified, hunted, captured. A man with no face was everywhere and nowhere. As midnight approached, the town of Milton quieted down, the excitement of the robbery fading into the stupor of sleep. But Shine remained awake, his mind replaying the moment the box hit the ground. He felt a pang of shame for how quickly he had complied, for how easily he had been cowed. He wondered if he should have drawn his pistol, if he should have whipped the horses and tried to run the bandit down. But then he remembered the shotgun, the two black eyes of death staring at him, and he knew he had made the only choice possible. The company could replace the gold. His wife could not replace him. The first robbery was over, but the echo of it would ring for a decade. The man who walked away from the scene carrying the heavy sacks of gold dust was not just Charles Bowles anymore. He had successfully tested his hypothesis. That fear was a more potent weapon than lead, and that a single man armed with a prop and a costume could command the obedience of the world. John Shine was the first believer in this new religion of terror, converted at the altar of the Reynolds Ferry Road, his faith sealed by the terrifying silence of the masked man. The act had begun, the curtain had risen, and the audience, terrified and captivated, was waiting for the next scene. The coastal fog rolling off the Pacific Ocean on the morning of August 3rd, 1877, was a living entity. A cold gray dampness that clung to the towering redwoods along the Russian River. It was a stark contrast to the dry, baking heat of the Sierra foothills where the phantom of the highway had first made his name. Here in the dense forests of Sonoma County, the world was a cathedral of shadows and moisture, the ground carpeted in a thick layer of needles that silenced the heaviest footfall. Charles Bowles crouched in the undergrowth near the road between Point Arena and Duncan's Mills, his linen duster absorbing the ambient moisture, turning heavy and stiff against his frame. The silence here was profound, broken only by the distant rhythmic crashing of the surf against the cliffs miles away, and the occasional drip of condensation falling from the canopy hundreds of feet above. This was a place where ancient things grew and where a man could disappear simply by standing still. The target today was the stagecoach connecting the coastal lumber camps with the inland railheads, a route that carried the payrolls and the profits of an industry that was stripping the forests bare. Bowles had scouted the location with his usual meticulous care, choosing a bend in the road where the grade was steep and the mud deep, forcing the horses to slow to a crawl. He was no longer the tentative experimenter who had stepped out on the Reynolds Ferry Road 2 years prior. He was now a practitioner of a dark art, a man who had refined the robbery of stagecoaches into a procedural discipline. But today he intended to add a new element to the performance, a flourish that would elevate his crimes from mere theft to psychological warfare. In his pocket, folded into a tight square, rested a piece of paper that contained the distillation of his rage, a message that would transform him from an anonymous threat into a specific nightmare. He heard the stage long before he saw it, the jingle of the harness and the creak of the wheels echoing strangely in the mist. The driver, a man named Jesse, was urging the team forward, his voice muffled by the dense air. The coach emerged from the fog like a ship coming out of a storm, the horses steaming, their breath visible in the chill morning. Bowles stepped out from behind a massive redwood trunk, the flour sack mask already in place, the shotgun leveled. The visual impact was just as potent here in the gloom as it had been in the sun. The white mask seemed to float in the gray air, a disembodied skull commanding the road. "Halt!" Bowles commanded, his voice pitching low to cut through the damp air. The command was not a scream, but a statement of fact. The driver hauled on the reins, the brakes screeching against the iron tires as the coach slid to a stop in the mud. The horses, sensing the tension, tossed their heads, their eyes rolling white in the gloom. Jesse looked down at the figure in the road, his eyes widening as he took in the shotgun and the silent, motionless stance of the highwayman. There was no hesitation this time, no moment of disbelief. The reputation of the masked bandit had traveled, whispered in the saloons and the stables. A ghost story that had suddenly become real. "Throw down the box," Bowles ordered, the ritual familiar now. He watched as the driver struggled with the heavy chest, the wood slick with moisture. It crashed into the mud with a wet thud, sinking slightly into the soft earth. Bowles gestured with the shotgun barrels, a sharp, efficient movement indicating that the driver should move on. He did not want conversation. He did not want to delay. The stagecoach lurched forward, the wheels spinning for purchase before gripping the road, the vehicle disappearing back into the fog as quickly as it had arrived. Bowles was alone again, the silence rushing back in to fill the void left by the departing rattled wagon. He moved quickly to the box, his boots squelching, in the mud. He produced a hatchet from beneath his duster, the metal gleaming dull in the low light. With a series of practiced, violent strikes, he smashed the lock, the sound of metal on metal ringing out sharp and discordant in the quiet forest. He ripped the lid open, exposing the canvas sacks of coin and the envelopes of mail. He transferred the loot to his own sack, his movements precise, checking the contents with the eye of an accountant. But before he closed his own bag, he paused. The moment had come to leave his mark. He took the folded paper from his pocket. He had written the verse days before, laboring over the words in the solitude of a rented room, pouring his resentment onto the page. It was not Shakespeare, but it was raw, honest, and filled with a venom that had been fermenting since the loss of his water rights in Montana. He placed the paper carefully on top of the broken strongbox, weighting it down with a stone so the coastal breeze would not carry it away. It was a message to the pursuers, to the detectives, to the company men who sat in plush offices in San Francisco while men like him froze in the mud. The poem read, "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've trod, you fine-haired sons of bitches." Below the verse, he had signed it with a moniker that would soon be printed in every newspaper in the West. Black Bart, the PO8. The spelling of poet as PO8 was a dark joke, a bit of gallows humor that signaled he was not just a brute, but a man of wit, a man who could laugh while he robbed them blind. He stared at the note for a moment, satisfying himself that it was legible, that the insult would land with the intended force. Then he shouldered his sack and melted back into the redwoods. The escape from the Russian River was a grueling physical ordeal. The terrain was rugged, a series of steep ridges and deep ravines choked with ferns and blackberry brambles that tore at his clothes and skin. Bowles moved with a relentless pace, putting miles between himself and the crime scene before the alarm could be raised. He climbed slopes that were nearly vertical, pulling himself up by tree roots, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sack of gold was a dead weight on his back, the straps digging into his shoulders, but he did not slow down. He knew that the fog would lift, that the trackers would come, and that his only safety lay in distance and anonymity. As he hiked, the adrenaline faded, replaced by the grim satisfaction of the act. He imagined the scene when the box was found. He pictured the confusion of the sheriff, the outrage of the Wells Fargo agents as they read the verse. He had called them sons of bitches to their faces, or at least to their proxy, and he had done it while taking their gold. It was a reclaiming of power, a way to assert his existence in a world that had tried to erase him. He was no longer just a victim of corporate greed. He was an antagonist, a villain who demanded respect. When the stagecoach reached Duncan's Mills and the news was telegraphed to the authorities, the reaction was exactly as he had calculated. The sheriff of Sonoma County rode out with a posse expecting to find the usual debris of a robbery. What they found instead was the birth of a legend. The deputy who picked up the piece of paper read it aloud, his voice stumbling over the rhythm of the words. The men gathered around, hardened lawmen and trackers looked at each other in bewilderment. Robbers did not write poetry. Robbers were desperate men who drank their loot and got shot in brothels. This was something different. This was a man who was taunting them. The note was carefully collected, treated with the reverence of a religious artifact. It was sent to San Francisco, where it landed on the desk of James B. Hume, the chief detective of Wells Fargo. Hume was a man of logic, an investigator who believed in measurements and facts. He stared at the handwriting, noting the firm strokes, the educated script. He read the verse and saw not a joke, but a profile. The man was educated. He was angry. He felt aggrieved. The reference to laboring for bread and having his corns trod on suggested a man who felt he had been wronged by society. A man who viewed his crimes as a form of retributive justice. The newspapers seized upon the story with a voracious appetite. The San Francisco Chronicle, the Call, the Examiner. They all ran the text of the poem on the front page. The name Black Bart was printed in bold type, a moniker that evoked images of pirates and dark nights. The public, tired of the grim news of economic depression and political corruption, devoured the story. Here was a bandit who had style, who had a voice. He wasn't killing drivers, he was leaving rhymes. A strange sort of admiration began to take root in the populace. They saw him as a Robin Hood figure, a man sticking it to the hated railroad and banking monopolies. But for Bowles, huddled in a thicket miles away, eating cold meat and listening to the sounds of the forest, there was no romance in the moment. There was only the cold reality of survival. He was wet, he was tired, and he was alone. The persona of Black Bart was a shield, a mask he wore to protect the fragile human beneath. Charles Bowles was an aging man with rheumatism and a family he could never see again. Black Bart was ageless, invincible, a phantom who floated above the mud and the misery. He needed the phantom to survive the reality. He spent the night in the hollow of a burnt-out redwood, the charred wood smelling of ancient fires. He did not light a fire of his own, fearing the smoke would give away his position. He shivered in the damp darkness, his mind racing. The poem was a risk, he knew that. Handwriting could be identified, the paper could be traced. But the compulsion to speak, to force them to hear him, had been overwhelming. He had lived in silence, for too long, a nameless cog in the machine. Now they knew his name, or at least the name he had chosen for them. The days following the robbery were a tense game of cat and mouse. He moved south toward the bay, blending in with the tramps and the laborers who wandered the roads. He buried the shotgun and the duster in a secure cache, marking the spot in his memory. He changed his clothes, washing the mud from his face, shaving the stubble that had grown during his time in the wild. When he finally boarded a ferry to San Francisco, he was no longer the highwayman. He was Mr. Bolton, a mining engineer, a respectable gentleman with a stiff walk and a polite demeanor. He sat among the citizens, reading the newspaper accounts of his own crime, watching the passengers shake their heads in wonder at the audacity of this Black Bart. The poem had changed the stakes. Wells Fargo doubled the reward. They were not amused by the insult. To them it was an attack on their dignity as well as their coffers. They hired more detectives, sent more men into the field. Hume began to build a file, a dossier of every scrap of information related to the bandit. He noted the descriptions: the linen duster, the flour sack, the deep voice, the polite commands. And now, the poetry. He looked for a man with a literary bent, perhaps a failed writer or a disgruntled teacher. He did not suspect the quiet man walking down Kearney Street with a cane. The psychological impact on the drivers was also profound. They were no longer just watching for a gunman. They were watching for a lunatic. A man who wrote verses was unpredictable. Was he sane? Was he playing a game? The uncertainty added a layer of dread to every journey. The P08 signature became a symbol of the unknown variable in the equation of the road. Every time a stage was stopped, the driver wondered if he would be the next recipient of a stanza, the next prop in the Bandit's theater. Bowles back in the city felt a strange dissonance. He walked the paved streets, ate in fine restaurants, and listened to the opera, but a part of him was still back in the dripping forest, standing in the mud with a shotgun. The two halves of his life were pulling apart, the tension between the gentleman and the outlaw growing with every crime. The poem was a bridge between them, a way for the educated man to express the rage of the outlaw. It was an act of integration, however twisted. He visited the Mercantile Library, reading books on history and mechanics, maintaining his cover. But his eyes would drift to the poetry sections, to the works of Byron and Shelley. He wondered if they would have understood his verse. He wondered if they would have seen the pathos beneath the profanity. Fine-haired sons of bitches, it was a phrase born of the mining camps of the army, a phrase of the common man spitting in the face of the aristocrat. He savored the memory of writing it, the feel of the pencil on the paper, the finality of the dot after P08. The robbery at the Russian River was not his most lucrative. The take was modest compared to some of the gold shipments he would intercept later. But it was the most significant. It was the moment Charles Bowles decided that he would not just be a thief, but a character in the grand narrative of the West. He understood that history did not remember the quiet men who followed the rules. It remembered the noisemakers, the disruptors. He had decided to make noise. As August turned to September, the heat returned and the fog retreated to the ocean. The incident began to fade from the daily headlines, replaced by new scandals and new tragedies. But the name stuck. Black Bart was now a fixture in the public consciousness. In the saloons of the Barbary Coast, men drank toasts to the poet of the road. In the boardrooms of Wells Fargo, men cursed his name and authorized more funds for his capture. And in a small room in a boarding house, Charles Bowles sat by the window, watching the fog roll in through the Golden Gate, planning his next stanza. He knew he could not write a poem every time. That would dilute the impact. It had to be rare, a special occurrence that kept them guessing. He had established the precedent. Now he could let the silence do the work. The threat of the poem was as powerful as the poem itself. He had planted a seed of chaos in the orderly world of commerce, and he intended to watch it grow. The memory of the Russian River stayed with him. The smell of the wet earth, the towering trees that made him feel like an insect, the rush of power as he placed the paper on the box. It was a high that no drug could match. It was the feeling of total control, of imposing his will on the universe. For a man who had been battered by war and bankruptcy, it was an addictive elixir. He was already thinking of the next location, the next stage, the next opportunity to step out of the shadows and stop the world in its tracks. The verse, written in fear, fear of poverty, fear of oblivion, fear of being nothing, had become a weapon of fear against others. The transformation was complete. The farmer from Illinois was dead. The soldier was retired. The miner was bankrupt. Only the poet remained, and he had miles to go before he slept. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the plow and the musket and the pickaxe. Now they held the pen and the shotgun, tools of a different trade, but tools nonetheless. He flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness of age, but also the strength of resolve. The act was far from over. The curtain had just risen on the second act. The years spanning from 1878 to 1881 defined the physical legend of Black Bart, transforming him from a mere highwayman into a spectral entity that seemed to possess the ability to evaporate into the Sierra Nevada landscape. While the newspapers in San Francisco printed sensational stories of a daring bandit, the reality of Charles Bowles' existence during this period was a grueling marathon of endurance that would have broken a man half his age. He was 50 years old in 1879, a time when most men of his generation were settling into the sedentary comfort of old age. Yet he was subjecting his body to a regimen of exertion that rivaled the most punishing military campaigns. The robbery itself was merely the punctuation mark in a long sentence of travel. The true work lay in the hundreds of miles of traversing the most unforgiving terrain in California on foot. Moving like a shadow across the spine of the mountains, he operated on a scale that baffled the lawmen pursuing him. The sheriffs and Wells Fargo detectives, including the tenacious James B. Hume, operated under the assumption that a criminal would use a horse to escape the scene of a crime. A horse offered speed, but it also required water, fodder, and a trail, and it left a distinct signature in the earth that could be followed by any competent tracker. Bowles understood this limitation and rejected it. He became a pedestrian of the wilderness, turning his own two legs into his primary mode of transport. He would rob a stage in Butte County on a Tuesday, and by Friday he would be 60 miles away in the precipitous canyons of Plumas County, having crossed ridges and rivers that no mounted posse could navigate. This mobility allowed him to strike with impunity, creating the illusion that he was everywhere at once, a ghost who materialized from the dust and vanished just as quickly. The physical toll of this strategy was immense. Bowles walked with a terrifying consistency, often covering 50 miles in a single 24-hour period. He did not walk on the flat, graded roads used by the wagons. He moved cross-country, cutting through the dense chaparral where the manzanita grew so thick it tore the clothes from a man's body. He scrambled up scree slopes where every step required a calculation of balance and friction, his boots sliding on the loose shale. He waded through mountain streams swollen with snowmelt, the freezing water numbing his legs and turning his feet into blocks of ice. He did this carrying a 20-pound sack of gear plus the added weight of the shotgun and the gold he had stolen. His body became a machine of gristle and bone, stripped of all fat, his skin weathered to the texture of cured leather by the sun and the wind. The nights were a particular form of torture. To maintain his invisibility, Bowles strictly forbade himself the luxury of a campfire. A fire was a beacon in the dark, a signal that could be seen for miles from the high ridges. This meant that for weeks at a time he lived without warmth. He slept on the hard ground, curling himself into the hollows of trees or under the overhang of granite boulders, wrapped only in his blankets. In the winter months, when the temperature in the high country dropped well below freezing, he would wake with frost coating his mustache and his limbs stiff with a paralyzing cold. He learned to sleep in short bursts, waking frequently to massage the circulation back into his extremities, a constant battle against hypothermia that left him perpetually exhausted. His diet during these expeditions was as Spartan and gritty as his lodgings. Without a fire, he could not cook coffee or boil beans. He subsisted on what he could carry in his pockets and his sack: tins of sardines, crackers, dried beef, and sugar. There were times, deep in the back country, when his supplies ran low and he was forced to eat raw meat, chewing on the cold, salty fat of cured pork or the stringy flesh of a rabbit caught in a snare. He ate not for pleasure but for fuel, shoving the food into his mouth while he walked, his eyes scanning the horizon for pursuit. The lack of hot food and the constant intake of dry, preserved rations wreaked havoc on his digestion, causing chronic stomach pains that plagued him as he hiked. He was a man gnawed from the inside by hunger and from the outside by the elements. The isolation was absolute. For days, sometimes weeks, he would not hear a human voice. The only sounds were the wind in the pines, the scream of a hawk, and the crunch of his own boots on the gravel. This silence was a heavy blanket that smothered the mind. Bowles had to maintain a rigid mental discipline to keep from drifting into madness. He focused on the mechanics of the walk, counting his steps, analyzing the terrain, planning his route to the next water source. He became a creature of the wild, his senses sharpening to a predatory edge. He could smell the dust raised by a stagecoach miles away. He could hear the snap of a twig that signaled the approach of a deer or a man. He moved through the woods with the caution of a cougar, freezing at the slightest disturbance, blending his silhouette with the trunks of the trees. Despite his incredible fitness, the years were beginning to exact their price. Rheumatism, a legacy of his time in the wet trenches of Vicksburg and the freezing ditches of Montana, began to settle into his joints. His knees and hips ached with a dull, throbbing pain that intensified with every mile. There were mornings when he could barely stand, his lower back locked in a spasm of agony. He carried small bottles of liniment in his sack, rubbing the stinging oil into his skin in the dark, trying to coax enough mobility into his limbs to continue the march. He also began to rely on laudanum, an opiate mixture common at the time to dull the sharp edges of the pain. The image of the dashing highwayman was a lie. The reality was an aging man swallowing bitter medicine in the dirt, forcing his broken body to perform feats that would kill a younger man. The deception required to maintain his double life added another layer of strain. After weeks of living like an animal in the wilderness, Bowles would have to transition back to the persona of Charles Bolton, the respectable mining engineer. He would bury his shotgun and his duster in a hollow log or a rock crevice, marking the spot with a secret sign. He would wash the grime from his body in a freezing creek, scrubbing until his skin was raw, trying to remove the smell of the wild. He would change into the fresh clothes he had stashed, combing his hair and trimming his beard. Then he would walk into a town like Marysville or Sacramento, boarding a train for San Francisco. The transition was jarring. One moment he was a hunted outlaw sleeping in the mud. The next, he was sitting on a velvet seat smoking a cigar, discussing the price of stocks with a fellow passenger. This psychological whiplash required a dissociation that fractured his identity, creating a wall between the man in the woods and the man in the city. Between 1878 and 1881, Bowles committed nearly 20 robberies, a staggering number that kept the entire region in a state of high anxiety. Each operation followed a similar pattern of extreme physical exertion. In October of 1878, he robbed the stage in Mendocino County, then immediately marched nearly 100 miles south through the rugged coastal range to strike again in Sonoma County just days later. The detectives were baffled, unable to comprehend how the same man could appear in two distant locations in such a short time frame. They began to suspect a gang, or perhaps copycats, failing to grasp the sheer tenacity of the lone walker. Bowles used their confusion as a weapon, deliberately zigzagging his route, doubling back on his own tracks, walking in streams to hide his scent from the dogs. One particular trek in the summer of 1879 highlighted the brutality of his existence. After a robbery near La Porte, he found himself hemmed in by a posse that had mobilized quickly, blocking the main passes. Bowles was forced to ascend into the high granite peaks of the Sierra, traversing snowfields that lingered even in July. The glare of the sun on the snow blinded him, burning his retinas until his eyes streamed with tears. He wrapped rags around his boots to gain traction on the ice, slipping and sliding on the precipice of 1,000-foot drops. He spent 2 nights above the timberline, shivering in the thin air, huddled against a rock face while the wind howled like a banshee. He ran out of water and had to eat snow, which lowered his core temperature and induced violent shivering fits. When he finally descended into the valley on the other side, he was a skeleton, his face burnt black by the sun, his lips cracked and bleeding. Yet he walked into the town of Oroville, purchased a new suit, and vanished onto a train, leaving the posse searching the empty mountains. The environment itself was often more dangerous than the lawmen. Bowles encountered rattlesnakes sunning themselves on the trails, their buzzing tails a warning of instant death in a place where no doctor could reach him. He navigated through thickets of poison oak, his skin breaking out in weeping blisters that itched maddeningly under his clothes. He faced the threat of black bears and mountain lions, creatures that owned the night and viewed him as an intruder. On one occasion, while crossing a swollen river in Plumas County, he lost his footing and was swept downstream, his heavy pack dragging him under the churning water. He fought the current with desperate strength, clawing at the slippery rocks, finally hauling himself onto the bank, gasping and half-drowned. He lost his hat and some of his food, but he saved the shotgun and the gold. He lay on the bank for an hour, coughing up water before wringing out his clothes and continuing the march. He also had to contend with the random encounters that could unravel his anonymity. Lonely prospectors, hunters, and sheep herders roamed the same hills, and Bowles had to avoid them at all costs. If he saw a campfire in the distance, he would detour miles around it, moving through the brush like a phantom. If he encountered someone on the trail, he would have to bluff, using his refined voice and his mining engineer cover story. He carried a notebook filled with fake geological observations, ready to show it to anyone who questioned his presence. These interactions were fraught with tension. One slip of the tongue, one look at the shotgun concealed in his bedroll, could end his career. He learned to project an air of harmless eccentricity, the wandering rockhound who was of no interest to anyone. The sheer repetition of the act began to wear on him. The thrill of the robbery faded, replaced by the grim necessity of the work. It became a job, a dangerous, exhausting trade that he practiced with grim efficiency. He knew the schedules of the stages better than the station agents. He knew which drivers were brave and which were cowards. He knew the weight of the gold dust and the feel of the coin sacks. He stopped writing poems during this period. The whimsy had been ground out of him by the miles. There was no energy left for verse, only for survival. The silence of the ghost in the dust was not an artistic choice. It was a reflection of his narrowing world, where only the road and the load existed. In 1880, the weather turned against him with a vengeance. An early winter storm caught him in the mountains of Sierra County, dumping feet of snow on the passes. Bowles was trapped, unable to move forward or back without risking death by exposure. He found shelter in an abandoned miner's cabin, a rotting structure with a leaking roof and a dirt floor. He spent 4 days there, trapped by the blizzard, burning the furniture to keep from freezing. He ran out of food and had to hunt rats in the corners of the cabin, skinning the rodents and roasting them over the smoky fire. It was a low point, a moment of abject misery that stripped away any lingering romance of the outlaw life. He sat in the dark, chewing on the tough meat, listening to the wind tear at the shingles, wondering if he would die there alone and unmourned, his bones discovered years later by some wandering prospector. When the storm broke, he wrapped his feet in burlap sacks to protect them from the frostbite and trudged out through the deep drifts. The glare of the snow was blinding, and the effort of lifting his legs through the powder was exhausting. He made it to the lower elevations more dead than alive, his body consumed by the effort. He stumbled into a small settlement looking like a wild man and had to hide in a barn until he could regain enough strength to clean himself up. The recovery took weeks. The deep chill seemed to have permanently lodged itself in his bones. Despite the physical deterioration, his mind remained sharp. He continued to innovate, refining his disguises and his methods. He began to use the train system more strategically, robbing a stage near a rail line and then immediately boarding a train to escape the area, using the speed of the locomotive to outpace the telegraph news. He studied the maps of the Wells Fargo routes, looking for the choke points where the terrain forced the coaches to slow down. He became a master of logistics, planning his supply caches and his escape routes with the precision of a general. By 1881, the legend of Black Bart had reached its zenith. He was a household name, a figure of myth who terrified travelers and frustrated the authorities. But the man behind the mask was crumbling. His eyesight was beginning to fail, the edges of his vision blurring, making it harder to spot the distant figures of lawmen. His hearing, damaged by the roar of the cannons in the Civil War, was worsening, leaving him vulnerable to ambush. The teeth in his head were loosening from the poor diet and the scurvy, making it painful to eat the hardtack and the jerky. He was a shell of a man, held together by willpower and the fear of capture. The psychological burden of the ghost persona was also heavy. He could never relax, never let his guard down. Even in San Francisco, surrounded by the comforts of the city, he was constantly looking over his shoulder. He saw potential detectives in every face, heard suspicion in every casual question. The paranoia was a constant companion, a whispering voice that told him his luck was running out. He knew that he could not keep up the physical pace forever. The mountains were too high, the winters too cold, the miles too long. But he was trapped in the cycle. He needed the money to maintain his lifestyle, to support the illusion of the wealthy gentleman. He was on a treadmill that was moving faster and faster, and he had to keep running or be thrown off. The dust of the road had worked its way into his soul. He felt more at home in the silence of the chaparral than in the noise of the city. He began to resent the civilization he was trying to be a part of. The people in the restaurants and the theaters seemed soft and foolish, unaware of the brutal reality that lay just beyond the city limits. He looked at their hands, smooth and uncalloused, and felt a mixture of envy and contempt. They did not know what it was to walk 50 miles in a day. They did not know the taste of raw squirrel meat or the bite of the frost. He was a creature apart, a different species evolved for a different world. As 1881 drew to a close, Bowles prepared for yet another campaign. He checked his boots, looking for holes in the leather. He counted his shotgun shells, ensuring the powder was dry. He folded his duster and his flour sack mask, packing them away with the care of a priest handling vestments. He looked in the mirror at the face of Charles Bolton, the respectable gentleman, and saw the eyes of Black Bart staring back, tired, hard, and haunted. The ghost was ready to walk again, to dissolve into the landscape and terrorize the highways. But the man inside was screaming for rest, for a fire, for a home that didn't exist. The loose thread was fraying, the fabric of the act thinning with every step. The mountains were waiting, indifferent and cruel, ready to swallow him whole. By the dawn of 1882, the entity known as Black Bart had ceased to be merely a criminal and had transformed into a pervasive atmospheric condition that smothered Northern California. The panic was no longer confined to the specific locations of his crimes. It had metastasized into a regional hysteria that colored every interaction on the road and every shadow in the chaparral. The sheer longevity of his campaign, now stretching into its 7th year, had dismantled the public's faith in the ability of the state to protect its citizens. Travelers boarding stagecoaches in Sacramento or Marysville did so with the grim resignation of soldiers mounting a patrol in hostile territory. The stagecoach, once a symbol of progress and connection, had become a rolling target, a wooden box of vulnerability moving through a landscape that seemed to belong entirely to one man. The terror was fueled not by the frequency of violence, for the bandit had yet to fire a weapon, but by the omnipotence of his presence. He struck in Mendocino, then in Plumas, then in Yuba, creating a constellation of crime scenes that suggested a supernatural ability to traverse the rugged geography. This perceived ubiquity created a psychological prison for the drivers and the station agents. Every rustling bush, every snap of a dry twig, every shadow cast by a passing cloud was interpreted as the precursor to the appearance of the flour sack mask. The fear was a cold, constant pressure that tightened the chests of men who were otherwise hardened by the rigors of the frontier. They drove with their eyes darting from side to side, their hands sweating on the reins, waiting for the inevitable command to halt. This paranoia bred a dangerous volatility within the population. The frustration of the law enforcement agencies, humiliated time and again by the phantom highwayman, curdled into a reactive brutality that lashed out at anything resembling the suspect. The roads were filled with itinerant laborers, prospectors down on their luck, and wanderers seeking work. Men who fit the general description of the bandit simply by virtue of being dusty and alone. In 1882, being a stranger on a mountain road was a hazardous condition. Vigilante posses, fueled by whiskey and a desperate need to do something, roamed the counties, stopping solitary travelers at gunpoint. Innocence was no defense against a mob convinced they had finally cornered the devil. One such incident occurred near the town of Oroville in the blistering heat of July. A prospector named Silas Thorne, a man whose only crime was carrying a double-barreled shotgun for hunting small game and wearing a long canvas coat to protect against the dust, found himself surrounded by a group of 6 armed riders. They did not ask for his name or his business. They rode him down, circling him with weapons drawn, their faces twisted with the anticipation of violence. Thorne was dragged from the road, his hands bound with rough hemp rope that bit into his wrists, cutting off the circulation. The men rifled through his meager possessions, tearing apart his pack, scattering his flour and beans into the dirt, looking for the stolen gold or the signature mask. When they found nothing incriminating, their anger did not dissipate. It redirected itself toward the man himself. They accused him of burying the loot, of hiding the mask in a hollow tree. They interrogated him for hours under the midday sun, denying him water, prodding him with the muzzles of their rifles. One of the vigilantes, a man whose brother had been on a stage robbed months prior, struck Thorne across the face with the stock of his Winchester, splitting the skin over the cheekbone and sending a spray of blood onto the dry earth. Thorne pleaded, his voice cracking with thirst and fear, showing them his calloused hands, his miner's license, begging them to see reason. It was only the intervention of a passing sheriff who recognized Thorne from a previous camp that saved the man from a summary hanging. Thorne was left bruised and bleeding by the roadside, a casualty of a war he did not know he was fighting, his dignity stripped away by the collective madness that Black Bart had engineered. This atmosphere of suspicion eroded the social fabric of the mining communities. Neighbors looked at neighbors with new scrutiny. If a man paid for his supplies with gold coin instead of dust, the shopkeeper's eyes would narrow. If a local rancher took a trip to the city without a clear explanation, rumors would swirl in the saloons. The reward money offered by Wells Fargo and the postal authorities had reached a sum that tempted men to turn on their friends. The promise of thousands of dollars transformed the hunt into a lottery, where every accusation was a potential ticket to wealth. Accusations flew wildly, cluttering the desks of the sheriffs with false leads and vengeful tips from business rivals settling old scores under the guise of civic duty. James B. Hume, the chief detective for Wells Fargo, sat at the center of this storm in San Francisco, his office a repository for the state's anxiety. His files bulged with reports from every corner of the territory, a chaotic paper trail that led everywhere and nowhere. Hume was a man of science and deduction, but he was forced to wade through a swamp of superstition and incompetence. He read reports of the bandit being seen in 3 different counties on the same day. He received letters from clairvoyants claiming to have seen the robber's face in a trance. He dealt with local lawmen who were more interested in claiming the glory than in cooperating with the agency. The pressure from the company directors was immense. The losses were mounting, the insurance rates were climbing, and the public humiliation was damaging the brand. Hume knew that he was hunting a phantom, a man who understood the machinery of the investigation better than the investigators themselves. In the midst of this chaos, Charles Bowles continued his operations with a detached clinical precision. In 1882, he targeted the routes that were considered the most secure, the ones where the drivers had begun to relax their guard. On a cold morning in late January, he struck the stage near Cloverdale, a route that had been untouched for months. The weather was foul, a driving rain turning the road into a quagmire of brown sludge. The driver, a man named George, was huddled under his oilskins, his vision obscured by the downpour, the sound of the rain drowning out the world. He did not see the figure standing by the roadside until the horses shied away from the dark shape. Bowles stood in the mud, the water streaming off his duster, the flour sack mask sodden and clinging to his face. He looked less like a man and more like a bog creature risen from the earth. The shotgun was steady, the barrels plugged with corks to keep the powder dry, until the last possible second. "Halt," he said, the word cutting through the noise of the storm. The driver, paralyzed by the sudden apparition, hauled on the brake. The robbery proceeded with the usual mechanical efficiency, but there was a new edge to the interaction. The driver was shaking so violently that he could barely lift the box. Bowles watched him with the impassive gaze of the mask, noting the sheer terror in the man's eyes. He realized that he no longer needed to shout. His mere presence was enough to induce total compliance. He took the box and melted back into the rain, leaving the driver to hyperventilate on the box. The escape from this robbery was particularly grueling. Bowles had to cross the Russian River, which was swollen to a raging torrent by the winter storms. He found a fallen redwood spanning part of the channel and scrambled across the slick, moss-covered bark, the black water churning feet below him. He slipped once, his heart hammering against his ribs, as he grabbed a branch to steady himself, the weight of the gold threatening to pull him into the current. He made it to the far bank and disappeared into the redwood forest, a place where the trees were so massive and the undergrowth so dense that a regiment of soldiers could pass within 10 feet of him and see nothing. Throughout 1882, Bowles exploited the landscape with the skill of a master tactician. He knew that the posses would stick to the trails and the ridges, so he moved through the ravines and the creek beds. He knew they would look for smoke, so he ate cold rations. He knew they would expect him to flee away from civilization, so he often circled back and hid near the towns, watching the search parties ride out in the wrong direction. There was a grim satisfaction in observing the chaos he created. He would sit on a high promontory hidden by a screen of manzanita and watch the dust clouds of the pursuers miles away. He saw the glint of their rifles and the exhaustion of their horses. He was a single man defeating a mobilized army through intellect and endurance. However, the physical toll was becoming harder to ignore. The wet winter of 1882 seeped into his joints, the rheumatism flaring with a vengeance. His hands, once steady as rock, now trembled slightly after a long day of hiking. He began to rely more heavily on the trains to bridge the gaps between his target areas and his sanctuary in San Francisco. This increased his risk of exposure. The trains were patrolled, the conductors alert. Bowles had to maintain his persona of the gentleman miner perfectly, never letting the mask slip for a second. He sat in the smoking cars, listening to men discuss Black Bart, forcing himself to nod and agree with their calls for the bandit's hanging. It was a surreal performance, a man discussing his own execution with the people who would gladly pull the lever. The kingdom of terror was built on silence. Bowles spoke as little as possible during the robberies, knowing that his voice was a unique identifier. He stopped leaving poems. The risk of handwriting analysis was too great, and the novelty had worn off. Now the silence was the weapon. The drivers reported that he moved without sound, that he appeared without warning, that he seemed to communicate with the horses better than they did. This silence fed the myth. A man who shouted and cursed was human. A man who spoke in a quiet, hollow monotone was a monster. In the autumn of 1882, the pressure intensified. The postal inspectors joined forces with Wells Fargo, bringing federal resources to the hunt. They began to track the movement of gold dust, looking for anyone selling small quantities of amalgam in the city. Bowles had to be extremely cautious, laundering his stolen dust through a network of unsuspecting brokers claiming it came from a private mine in the interior. He lived in constant fear of a marked coin or a specific jewelry item being recognized. He spent hours in his room in San Francisco melting down the gold, destroying the evidence of its origin, turning the beautiful craftsmanship of the mint into shapeless lumps of metal. The room smelled of chemicals and fear. The hysteria reached a fever pitch in November when a stage was robbed in Yuba County, and the driver claimed that Bart had been accompanied by a second man in the bushes. This report sent shockwaves through the investigation. A gang meant organization. It meant a hideout. It meant a broadening of the threat. In reality, Bowles was still working alone, using his old trick of arranging sticks to look like rifle barrels, but the panic amplified the deception. The newspapers speculated on a black Bart gang, creating phantom accomplices out of thin air. This served Bowles well, as the posses wasted time looking for a group of men and ignored the solitary figure walking through the woods with a bedroll. The psychological dominance Bowles held over the region was absolute, but it was a fragile power. It relied entirely on the fact that he had never been seen without the mask. The moment his face was connected to the crime, the kingdom would collapse. He was acutely aware of this vulnerability. He avoided eye contact with strangers. He wore his hat pulled low. He changed his facial hair, alternating between a full beard, a mustache, and a clean-shaven look, creating a confusing array of descriptions for the detectives. He was a chameleon, changing his colors to match the background, but the effort of constant camouflage was exhausting his spirit. As the year drew to a close, the violence of the vigilantes began to turn inward. Frustrated by their failure to catch the bandit, communities began to blame their own sheriffs and deputies. Accusations of corruption and incompetence were rampant. Elections were decided on the single issue of who could catch Black Bart. The bandit had become a political force, a wedge that drove communities apart. Bowles, reading the papers in the city, saw the disintegration of the social order he was attacking. He had set out to punish Wells Fargo, but he was punishing the entire state. The thought gave him no pleasure. It was merely a strategic outcome, a measure of his effectiveness. The Christmas of 1882 was a bleak affair for the stage lines. Passenger traffic was down, shipments were delayed, and the drivers were on edge. The festive season was overshadowed by the specter of the man in the duster. Bowles spent the holiday in San Francisco, dining alone in a restaurant, a ghost at the banquet. He watched the families celebrating, the exchange of gifts, the laughter, and felt the immense crushing weight of his isolation. He was the king of a terror-stricken land, but his throne was a cold rock in the wilderness, and his subjects were people who wanted him dead. He knew that the net was tightening. The law of averages was against him. He had robbed 25 stages, walked thousands of miles, and evaded hundreds of pursuers. It was a statistical impossibility that he could continue indefinitely. Yet he could not stop. The lifestyle he had cultivated, the need for the adrenaline, the compulsion to strike back at the company drove him forward. He was trapped in the machinery of his own legend. The Kingdom of Terror was also his prison, and he was the inmate serving a life sentence of his own making. The year ended with a heavy snowstorm that blanketed the Sierra, sealing the passes and enforcing a temporary truce. The stages stopped running, the posses stayed indoors, and the white silence covered the tracks of the year's violence. Bowles remained in the city, resting his aching body, listening to the rain hammer against the window of his boarding house. He looked at the map on his wall, the lines of the roads tracing the veins of the state, and planned his spring campaign. He did not know that the next year would bring the end. He only knew that when the snow melted, he would have to go back out. The ghost could not rest. The mask was waiting. The impact of 1882 on the psyche of the West was profound. It proved that a single individual, armed with nothing but fear and a knowledge of the terrain, could hold a civilization hostage. It exposed the fragility of the law and the thin veneer of order that covered the frontier. The Kingdom of Terror was a lesson in the power of the asymmetrical threat. Black Bart had turned the strengths of the society, its roads, its schedules, its newspapers, into weaknesses. He had weaponized the very infrastructure of the state against itself. As the calendar turned, the tension in the air was palpable. The people of Northern California waited for the next act, their nerves frayed, their patience exhausted. The hunters were desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. The game had evolved from a chase into a siege. The loose thread that would unravel the act was already there, hidden in the fabric of the routine, waiting to be pulled. But for now, in the dying light of 1882, Black Bart stood tall, the undisputed master of the road, a dark monarch ruling over a kingdom of fear. The year 1883 arrived in San Francisco, riding a wave of cold, dense fog that rolled through the Golden Gate, smothering the gas lamps and turning the cobblestones of Market Street into slick, treacherous surfaces. Charles Bowles, known to the residents of the city as Charles E. Bolton, navigated this gray urban landscape with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime studying the art of camouflage. He walked with a stiff, dignified gait, aided by a cane that served both as a support for his rheumatic knees and a prop for his persona. He wore a heavy wool suit of charcoal gray, a stiff white collar that chafed against his neck, and a diamond stick pin that caught the dull light of the street lamps. To the casual observer, he was merely another face in the bustling crowd of the financial district, a mining engineer of indeterminate success enjoying the fruits of his labor. The city was a chaotic engine of commerce, a cacophony of iron wheels on stone shouting, "Newsboys," and the constant low-frequency rumble of industry that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He resided at the Webb House on 2nd Street, a respectable boarding establishment that catered to the transient middle class, men who had business in the city but no permanent roots. His room number 40 was a small, austere cube of space that served as the command center for his double life. The walls were papered in a floral pattern that had faded to a vague beige, and the furniture consisted of a narrow bed, a washstand, and a heavy oak desk where he conducted his correspondence. It was here, amidst the smell of coal smoke and floor wax, that the dusty phantom of the Sierra shed his skin and became the polite, soft-spoken gentleman. Bowles paid his rent promptly in gold coin, tipped the staff with a generosity that discouraged curiosity, and maintained a schedule so regular it could be used to set a watch. He ate his breakfast at the same bakery every morning, reading the Daily Morning Call or the Chronicle while sipping strong black coffee, scanning the columns for news of the manhunt that was targeting him. The deception required a constant low-level vigilance that was more exhausting than the physical labor of the trail. Every conversation was a minefield where a single slip of the tongue could detonate his carefully constructed reality. When fellow boarders asked about his mines, he spoke in vague technical terms about veins and hydrostatic pressure. about claims in the interior that required his periodic supervision. He had cultivated the vocabulary of the industry perfectly, using words like adit and stope and amalgam with the casual familiarity of an expert. He complained about the cost of timber and the scarcity of water, mirroring the grievances of legitimate operators so precisely that no one ever thought to ask for the specific location of his holdings. He was the perfect neighbor, quiet, courteous, and utterly boring, a man who blended into the background of the boarding house like a piece of furniture. The city itself was a stark contrast to the silence of the wilderness, a sensory assault of smells and sounds. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and the brine of the bay, a thick, cloying cocktail that irritated his lungs. The noise was incessant, a relentless wall of sound that made his head ache after the profound quiet of the high country. Yet he needed the city. It was the only place where he could convert the raw dust of his robberies into the currency of survival. The laundering of the loot was the most dangerous aspect of his existence, a transactional peril that carried the risk of immediate exposure. He could not simply walk into a bank and deposit 5 pounds of gold dust. Such an act would trigger instant suspicion. Instead, he had to navigate the network of gold brokers and money changers who operated in the shadows of the financial district, men who asked few questions as long as the assay was pure. On a Tuesday in February, Bowles prepared for one such transaction. He locked the door to room 40, engaging the deadbolt with a solid click. He moved to the bottom of his trunk beneath the piles of starched shirts and woolen socks and retrieved a leather pouch heavy with dust. This was the proceeds from the robbery in Siskiyou County months prior, a fine yellow powder that represented weeks of terror and miles of walking. He transferred a calculated amount into a smaller bag, hiding it inside the deep pocket of his overcoat. He checked his appearance in the mirror, adjusting his tie, smoothing his graying mustache. The face staring back was gaunt, the skin tight over the cheekbones, the eyes shadowed by fatigue. He looked like a man consuming himself from the inside out, an engine running on fumes. He walked to Montgomery Street, the financial heart of the West, where the buildings loomed like canyons of brick and mortar. He entered the office of a broker he had used before, a small, dusty shop that smelled of old paper and copper. The broker, a man with spectacles thick as bottle bottoms, looked up from his ledger with a squint. Bowles placed the small bag on the counter with a steady hand. "A small return from the Trinity claim," he said, his voice level and calm. "The weather has allowed us a brief window of washing." The lie was smooth, rehearsed a dozen times in the silence of his room. The broker opened the bag, pouring a sample onto the scale. The brass pans tipped, balancing the weight against the standard iron weights. Bowles watched the needle settle, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This was the moment of vulnerability, the second where the gold could be recognized by its color or grain size, though such identification was scientifically unlikely. The broker grunted, satisfied with the weight, and proceeded to test the purity with acid. The drop of liquid hissed on the metal, leaving the gold bright and untarnished. "Standard grade," the man muttered, reaching for his cash box. He counted out the coins, $20 gold pieces, the double eagles that were the lifeblood of the economy. Bowles took the money, sliding the heavy coins into his pocket. The transaction was over. He had successfully transformed the evidence of a felony into the trappings of a gentleman. He tipped his hat and walked out into the cool air, the sweat on his back turning cold against his skin. The relief was a physical sensation, a loosening of the knot in his stomach that had been there since he woke up. With the money secured, Bowles engaged in the rituals of the leisure class. He visited the Mechanics' Institute Library, a sanctuary of leather-bound books and hushed whispers. He sat in a high-backed chair, reading histories and scientific journals, feeding the intellect that the wilderness starved. He found a strange comfort in the orderliness of the library and the Dewey Decimal System that categorized all human knowledge into neat retrieval rows. It was the antithesis of the chaotic, sprawling nature of the gold fields. He read about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, about the excavations in Egypt, about the politics of Europe. For a few hours, he was not Black Bart. He was a scholar, a man of the world connecting with the broader current of civilization. He also frequented the theaters, purchasing tickets for the plays and operas that toured the coast. He sat in the velvet seats of the Bush Street Theater, watching actors pretend to be kings and villains, struck by the irony of the situation. He was the greatest actor in the building, playing a role with life or death stakes, yet the applause was reserved for the men on the stage who would wash off their makeup and go home to safe beds. He observed the wealthy patrons in the boxes, the women in their silk gowns and the men in their evening dress. He felt a mixture of envy and contempt for them. They were the beneficiaries of the system he attacked, the people who owned the stock in Wells Fargo, yet they were soft, oblivious creatures who would not survive a single night in the chaparral. The physical toll of his double life was becoming harder to conceal. The damp climate of San Francisco aggravated his rheumatism, sending shooting pains through his legs that made climbing the stairs of the Webb House a daily torture. He visited the pharmacies on Kearny Street, purchasing bottles of liniment and patent medicines that promised relief but delivered only a temporary numbing. He masked the scent of the medicine with bay rum cologne, a sharp, spicy fragrance that became part of his olfactory signature. He walked with the cane not just for affectation, but because on some days his hip joint felt like it was grinding bone on bone. The stairs to his room seemed to grow steeper with each passing week, a mountain he had to climb at the end of every day. In the privacy of his room, the mask dropped completely. He would sit on the edge of his bed, rubbing the liniment into his swollen knees, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. He looked at his hands, the calluses from the shotgun and the climbing hidden beneath gloves during the day, but undeniable in the gaslight. They were the hands of a laborer, thick-fingered and scarred, betraying the lie of the engineer who supposedly supervised from a distance. He kept his fingernails trimmed short and scrubbed them obsessively to remove the dirt that seemed permanently ingrained in the pores. He was fighting a war against his own body, trying to erase the physical evidence of his true profession. He kept a map of California pinned to the inside of his wardrobe door, hidden from the prying eyes of the maid. It was covered in small pencil marks, a constellation of crosses and circles that denoted water sources, stage routes, and escape trails. He spent his evenings studying it, planning the campaigns for the coming spring. He traced the lines of the roads with his finger, calculating distances and travel times. The map was his connection to the reality of the road, a paper proxy for the dirt and the dust. He memorized the topography of counties he had not yet visited, looking for the choke points where the terrain favored the ambusher. The planning was a way to impose order on the chaos, to ensure that when he stepped back onto the stage, he knew his lines perfectly. His relationship with the other tenants of the Webb House was cordial but distant. He would nod to them in the hallway, exchange pleasantries about the fog or the price of bread, but he never allowed anyone to get close. He declined invitations to play cards or drink in the parlor, pleading a headache or a backlog of work. Isolation was his primary defense. If no one knew him, no one could betray him. He was a solitary planet orbiting the social sun of the boarding house, visible but unreachable. He heard them talking about him sometimes, speculating on his bachelorhood, wondering why a man of his apparent means lived so simply. They concluded he was a miser or a widower grieving a lost love, fictions that served his purpose well. The financial pressure was a constant low-level hum in the background of his life. The lifestyle of a gentleman in San Francisco was expensive. The rent, the meals, the clothes, the travel, it all required a steady stream of gold. The loot from the robberies was significant, but the fencing of it yielded only a fraction of its true value. And the costs of his operations, the train tickets, the supplies, the bribes, ate into his profits. He was not robbing to amass a fortune. He was robbing to maintain the status quo. He was on a treadmill running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. The gold he brought in February would be gone by May, forcing him back out onto the road. He was trapped in a cycle of earning and spending that had no exit. As March approached, the weather began to turn, the rains lessening and the days growing longer. Bowles felt the pull of the road, a mixture of dread and anticipation. The city was stifling him. The noise, the people, the constant need to act. It was wearing him down. The wilderness, for all its brutality, offered a purity that the city lacked. Out there, the rules were simple. Survive or die. Here, the rules were complex webs of social etiquette and legal statutes. He began to gather his supplies, visiting the hardware stores on Market Street to purchase gunpowder and shot. He bought these items in small quantities from different vendors to avoid raising suspicion, a tedious process that required miles of walking. He inspected his shotgun, which he kept disassembled in his trunk wrapped in oilcloth. He cleaned the barrels, running the rag through the steel tubes until they shone. He oiled the lock mechanism, listening to the satisfying click of the hammers. The weapon was his only true companion, the one object that did not lie to him. It was an instrument of power that equalized the odds between the lone walker and the armed guards of the company. Holding it, even in the safety of his room, gave him a sense of agency that the cane never could. The laundry mark on his handkerchiefs was a detail he attended to with fastidious care. He used a specific laundry in the city, one that did good work with starched collars. The mark FX07 was inked onto the hem of his linens, a clerical tag used by the laundry to sort the garments. He never thought of it as a danger. It was just a domestic triviality, part of the mundane infrastructure of urban life. He ensured his clothes were clean and pressed before every trip, a habit of the gentleman that he carried into the wild. He would rob a stage wearing a clean shirt, a bizarre insistence on hygiene that set him apart from the unwashed ruffians of the frontier. One evening, while dining at a chop house on 3rd Street, he found himself seated near a table of police officers. They were loud, boisterous men, their uniforms unbuttoned at the collar, plates of steak and potatoes in front of them. Bowles ate his meal in silence, listening as they discussed the hunt for Black Bart. They mocked the sheriffs of the mountain counties, calling them incompetents and yokels. They bragged about what they would do if the bandit ever tried his tricks in the city limits. Bowles chewed his meat slowly, watching them with a cold, detached gaze. They were the hounds, confident in their numbers and their noise, unaware that the fox was sitting 10 feet away, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. The proximity to the law gave him a jolt of adrenaline, a reminder of the thin line he walked every day. He finished his meal, paid the bill with a gold coin that had once rested in a Wells Fargo strongbox, and walked out into the night. The fog had returned, wrapping the gas lamps in halos of mist. He walked back to the Webb house, the cane tapping a rhythm on the wet pavement. He passed the dark alleyways where the city's desperate and destitute slept in crates, huddled against the cold. He knew he was only one mistake away from joining them. If the money ran out, if the luck failed, if the mask slipped, the fall would be absolute. The gentleman of 2nd Street was a ghost, a construct of cloth and coin that would dissolve the moment the truth was known. Back in his room, he packed his valise. He placed the disassembled shotgun at the bottom, covering it with the rough clothes of the road, the denim trousers, the flannel shirts, the heavy boots. He packed the linen duster and the flour sack, the the costumes of his other self. He looked around the room, ensuring that nothing incriminating was left visible. He paid his rent in advance for the next 2 months, telling the landlady he was heading to the mines to oversee the spring sluicing. She wished him a safe journey, telling him to be careful of the bandits on the road. He smiled, a thin, tight expression. That did not reach his eyes, and thanked her for her concern. The transition was beginning. The Charles Bolton who walked down the stairs the next morning was already fading, the steel of Charles Bowles rising to the surface. He took a cab to the ferry building, watching the city slide past the window. He was leaving the comfort of the bed and the bakery for the hard ground and the raw meat. He was trading the cane for the gun. The gentleman was going to sleep and the beast was waking up. The cycle continued, the wheel turned, and the loose thread, unseen and unnoticed, dangled from the hem of a handkerchief tucked deep in his pocket, waiting for the snag that would unravel the entire tapestry. The dawn of November 3rd, 1883, broke over the Stanislaus River Valley with a deceptive clarity. The sky, a polished dome of hard blue slate that offered no hint of the violence waiting in the scrub. Charles Bowles lay in a nest of dry ferns on the slope of Funk Hill, his body pressed against the earth that had once been his accomplice but was rapidly becoming his adversary. He had returned to the site of his very first transgression, drawn back to the Reynolds Ferry Road by a mixture of necessity and a dangerous nostalgia. It had been 8 years since he had first stepped out of these bushes to confront John Shine. 8 years of walking the high passes and sleeping in the frost. The man who waited now was not the tentative novice of 1875. He was a hardened veteran of 28 robberies, his nerves seemingly made of wire, his movements stripped of all wasted energy. Yet the physical vessel was failing. The rheumatism in his hips was a constant grinding toothache, and his vision had begun to blur at the edges, forcing him to squint to distinguish the shape of a rock from the shape of a deer. He checked his position with the fussiness of an old engineer. The blind was perfect, a natural fortification of manzanita and poison oak that offered a clear field of fire onto the road while concealing him completely from the approaching stage. He had his shotgun, the 12-gauge loaded with buckshot, resting across his knees. He had his flour sack mask, folded and ready. He had the linen duster, now stained and frayed at the hem, buttoned to his chin to hide his city clothes. Everything was in order. The plan was the same as it had always been. Halt the stage, intimidate the driver, take the box and vanish. There was no reason to suspect that today would be any different from the dozens of days that preceded it. Down on the road, the stagecoach from the Sonora route rattled toward the hill, the horses laboring under the morning sun. The driver, Reason McConnell, held the ribbons with a relaxed grip, unaware that he was driving toward a historical pivot point. The coach was light today, carrying no passengers, only the mail and the Wells Fargo treasure box. However, McConnell was not entirely alone. Sitting on the box beside him was Jimmy Roleri, a 19-year-old boy from the local Italian community who had hitched a ride to check his snare lines and hunt for small game. A Henry rifle rested between the boy's knees, the brass receiver gleaming in the sunlight. The presence of the rifle was a variable Bowles had not accounted for, a random element introduced into a carefully calculated equation. As the stage began the slow, grinding ascent of Funk Hill, the horses dropped to a walk. The grade was steep here, the road cut deep into the reddish clay, enclosed by steep banks that turned the thoroughfare into a trench. Rollery, seeing the slow pace and spotting a jackrabbit darting into the brush near the creek bed, asked McConnell to let him off. He wanted to hunt along the slope and meet the stage on the other side of the hill. McConnell agreed, slowing the team enough for the boy to jump down. Rollery took his rifle and disappeared into the thicket, moving down toward the river. McConnell clucked to the team, urging them up the final stretch of the grade alone. The stagecoach was now exactly where Bowles wanted it. isolated, slow, and manned by a single driver. Bowles heard the creak of the thoroughbraces before the stage came into view. He pulled the flour sack over his head, adjusting the eye holes. The world narrowed to 2 circles of light. He stood up, his joints protesting with a sharp stab of pain, and stepped out from the manzanita. He planted himself in the center of the road, the shotgun leveled. "Halt!" The command was automatic, the voice deep and hollow. McConnell, startled by the sudden apparition, stomped on the brake lever. The coach shuddered to a halt, the horses, snorting and tossing their heads at the sight of the white mask. "Throw down the box," Bowles ordered, moving to the side of the lead horse to control the team. He kept the shotgun trained on McConnell, watching the driver's hands. McConnell looked down at the bandit, his face pale. "I can't," the driver stammered. "It's bolted down." This was the first deviation. Usually the boxes were loose or held by simple leather straps. A bolted box meant delay. It meant labor. Bowles felt a spike of irritation. He gestured with the gun. "Get down and unfasten it." McConnell shook his head. "I have no tools, you'll have to do it." Bowles cursed silently. He could not let the driver leave the box. That would give the man a chance to pull a weapon or spook the team. "Set the brake," Bowles commanded. "Get down and stand by the leaders." McConnell complied, climbing down slowly, his hands raised. Bowles kept one eye on the driver and moved to the side of the coach. He unslung a heavy hammer and a hatchet he carried in his sack for just such an eventuality. He climbed onto the wheel hub, reaching into the boot of the stage. The box was indeed fastened securely to the floorboards with heavy iron bolts. He began to attack the floor of the coach with the hatchet, the wood splintering under the blows. The sound was dangerously loud in the quiet canyon. Thwack, crack, thwack. He was working frantically, his breath coming in short gasps, the sweat beginning to pour down his face under the mask. He was 60 feet from the blind, exposed on the side of the wagon, his attention divided between the demolition and the driver. The minutes ticked by, precious grains of sand slipping through the hourglass. The box was stubborn, the bolts rusted and tight. He had to hack away the wood around the base to free it. He grunted with the effort, the physical exertion taxing his aging heart. Finally, with a wrenching crack, the box came free. Bowles dragged it over the side, letting it drop to the road with a heavy thud. He jumped down, his boots hitting the dust hard. He was winded, his chest heaving. He grabbed the sack of gold coin he had prepared to transfer the loot into. He was bending over the box, preparing to smash the lock, when a movement on the hill caught his peripheral vision. Jimmy Rolary had heard the commotion from the creek bed. The sound of the hatchet striking wood did not sound like a broken wheel. He had crept back up the slope, the Henry rifle held ready. He emerged from the brush about 100 yards away, looking down at the tableau. The stage stopped, McConnell standing by the horses, and a man in a duster destroying the strongbox. McConnell saw the boy before Bowles did. The driver waved his hand frantically, signaling toward the bandit. "Shoot him, Jimmy, shoot him!" McConnell yelled, his voice cracking with the release of tension. Bowles spun around, the shotgun coming up. He saw the boy on the hill, the rifle shouldered. The distance was significant, but the threat was lethal. Bowles knew he could not win a shootout with a rifleman at that range using a shotgun loaded with birdshot. He made an instant calculation. He grabbed the sack of loot, which contained several $100s in gold coin and amalgam, and abandoned the rest of the mail. He turned and ran, diving into the dense chaparral on the lower side of the road. A sharp crack echoed through the canyon as Rolary fired. The slug whined past Bowles's head, slapping into the clay bank. Bowles scrambled through the brush, the branches whipping his face, the thorns tearing at his duster. He was running for his life now, all dignity gone, a desperate animal fleeing the hunter. He heard the lever of the Henry rifle rack another round. "Give me the gun!" McConnell shouted, grabbing the rifle from the boy as the bandit disappeared into the scrub. McConnell was older, steadier. He aimed at the moving bushes, waiting for a glimpse of the duster. Bowles broke cover for a second, darting between two manzanita bushes. McConnell tracked him and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck. It did not hit a vital organ, but the impact was violent. The heavy projectile smashed into Bowles's left hand, which he was using to push branches aside. It shattered the knuckle and tore through the flesh, exiting the palm and grazing his side. The pain was blinding, a white-hot explosion that traveled up his arm and slammed into his brain. Bowles stumbled, nearly falling. A guttural cry of agony ripped from his throat. He looked down and saw his hand was a ruin of blood and bone, the white cuff of his shirt instantly turning crimson. He did not stop. He could not stop. He clutched the wounded hand to his chest, his right hand gripping the sack of gold and the shotgun. He plunged deeper into the ravine, sliding down a steep embankment of loose shale. The blood from his hand sprayed onto the quartz rocks, bright red arterial splashes that marked his passage like a trail of paint. The shock was setting in, a cold numbness spreading from his extremities, but the adrenaline of survival kept his legs moving. He ran for a mile, twisting through the bottom of the canyon, using the terrain to block the line of sight from the road. He could hear shouting behind him, the sounds of pursuit beginning to organize. He knew he had to lose the weight. He stopped for a brief second, his chest heaving like a bellows, and dropped the shotgun. It clattered into a pile of dead leaves. He stripped off the linen duster, which was now a liability, a bright flag in the dark woods. He rolled it up clumsily with his one good hand, stuffing it into a hollow log. But in his panic, in the haze of pain and blood, he made the mistake that would destroy him. He had been carrying a bundle of personal items, a magnifying glass, a pair of field glasses, and a handkerchief containing a little sugar for his coffee. As he fumbled to treat his wound, the handkerchief fell from his pocket. It landed softly on the pile of pine needles, a square of white linen stained with a single smear of fresh blood. Bowles, his eyes watering from the pain, did not see it fall. He was focused entirely on the mangled meat of his hand. He tore a strip from his shirt lining with his teeth and wrapped it tightly around the wound, pulling the knot tight with his teeth in his good hand. The pressure sent fresh waves of nausea through him, but the bleeding slowed to a dark ooze. He had to keep moving. The local men would be gathering. The telegraph wires would be singing. He was wounded, he was old, and he was miles from safety. He forced himself to slow down, to stop the frantic crashing that made so much noise. He adopted the silent walk of the ghost, placing his feet carefully despite the agony. He moved up a tributary canyon, heading toward the high ridges where the rock would hide his tracks. He stopped at a small creek to wash the worst of the blood from his coat, the icy water stinging, the raw wound. He watched the red swirl away in the current, vanishing downstream. As the afternoon wore on, Bowles reached a high point overlooking the valley. He collapsed against a granite boulder, his body trembling uncontrollably. The pain in his hand had settled into a deep, throbbing rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He looked at the injury. The bullet had done terrible work. He would never hold a steady aim with that hand again. The career of Black Bart ended on that hillside, not with a hangman's noose, but with a piece of lead from a boy's rifle. He checked his pockets, taking inventory of his disaster. He realized the handkerchief was gone. He patted his coat, his trousers. Nothing. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, settled in his stomach. He tried to remember where he had been standing, what he had dropped. He remembered the derby hat he had lost in the first scramble. He remembered the magnifying glass, but the handkerchief, that was personal. That was a connection to the man in the city. Down below, at the scene of the robbery, the silence had returned. McConnell and Rolleri had gathered the scattered mail and the tools the bandit had left behind. They walked through the brush, tracking the blood. They found the shotgun. They found the hat. And then lying innocuously on the ground, they found the handkerchief. McConnell picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was heavy, stiff with sugar, and marked in the corner with a laundry stamp in indelible ink. FX07. Bowles did not know that the net was already closing. He only knew that he was hurt and hunted. He stood up, forcing his stiff legs to work. He had to get to the lower country. He had to get to a town where he could board a train without raising suspicion. He had to become Charles Bolton again, but Charles Bolton did not have a shattered hand. He wrapped his hand inside his coat, buttoning it tight to create a sling. He composed his face, smoothing the lines of pain into a mask of grim endurance. He began the long walk west, moving through the shadows of the oaks. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the path. Every step was a battle against the desire to lie down and sleep. He hallucinated slightly, seeing figures in the trees, hearing voices in the wind. He thought of the warm room on 2nd Street, of the books in the library, of the life that was slipping away from him. He bypassed the town of Copperopolis, circling wide to avoid the lights. He knew the sheriff there would be organizing a posse. He headed for the darker, wilder country toward Angel's Camp. He ate nothing. The thought of food made him retch. He drank from cattle troughs, scooping the green water with his good hand. The night was freezing. The temperature dropped, and the sweat on his clothes turned to ice. His wounded hand throbbed and swelled, the infection already beginning to take hold in the damaged tissue. He kept walking. To stop was to die. He was a machine fueled by fear, driving himself toward a sanctuary that might no longer exist. He reached a road well past midnight. He waited in a ditch until a freight wagon rumbled past, heading toward the coast. He climbed onto the back, hiding among the crates, letting the wagon carry him away from the scene of his ruin. The vibration of the wheels jarred his hand, sending fresh spikes of pain through his arm. But he bit his lip and remained silent. He lay in the dark, listening to the driver whistle a tune, a simple, happy sound that contrasted sharply with the grim reality of the man bleeding in the cargo. The loose thread had been pulled. The act was unraveling with terrifying speed. The blood on the manzanita was already drying, turning black in the mountain air, but the mark on the laundry was indelible. The gentleman bandit had left his calling card, and this time, it was not a poem. It was his name. The handkerchief lay on the polished oak desk of James B. Hume in the Wells Fargo offices on Sansom Street, a square of white linen that looked deceptively innocent against the dark wood. It was November of 1883, and the hunt for the highwayman had narrowed from the sprawling vastness of the Sierra Nevada to this single, tangible object. The fabric was stiff with dried sugar and stained with the rust-colored smear of Charles Bowles' blood. But the focus of the investigation was the laundry mark inked into the corner. FX07. This cryptic alphanumeric string was the loose thread that Detective Harry Morse intended to pull until the entire tapestry of the bandit's life unraveled. Morse, a man of relentless procedural energy, understood that the wild man of the woods was a fiction. The perpetrator was a man who lived in civilization, a man who wore starched collars and required professional cleaning services. The investigation moved from the chaparral to the steam-choked alleyways of San Francisco, a grid search of the city's 91 laundry agencies that required a patience as grueling as any mountain trek. Morse spent days visiting the distribution centers where the Chinese laundries collected and returned their goods, showing the handkerchief to the agents, watching their eyes for recognition. It was a tedious, unglamorous process of elimination, walking the wet cobblestones from the Barbary coast to the Mission, inhaling the scents of lye soap and coal smoke. The breakthrough arrived at the storefront of Ferguson and Big, a tobacco shop on Bush Street that served as a drop-off point for the Bartlett Springs laundry. The clerk, A man whose world was defined by ledgers and inventory recognized the mark immediately. He identified the owner of the mark not as a bandit, but as a respectable mining engineer who lived around the corner at the Webb House, a Mr. Charles E. Bolton. The Phantom finally had a name, an address, and a face. The arrest was not a dramatic shootout in a dusty street, but a quiet, tense confrontation in the heart of the bustling city. Morse and the local police waited near the tobacco shop, watching the pedestrian traffic with the predatory focus of wolves. When Bowles appeared, walking with his cane, looking every inch the gentleman in his tailored suit and bowler hat, there was a moment of cognitive dissonance for the officers. He did not look like the terror of the Sierra. He looked like a grandfather, a weary businessman heading to a meeting. Morse approached him, his hand resting near his revolver, but his voice calm. He invited the engineer to answer a few questions regarding some mining stocks, a ruse to get him into a controlled environment. Bowles, ever the actor, played the part of the confused citizen, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. He knew the game was up, yet he maintained the facade, accompanying them to the Wells Fargo building with a stiff dignity. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was stifling, the air thick with the smoke of cigars and the tension of the endgame. Hume and Morse presented the evidence with the methodical precision of surgeons. They laid out the handkerchief. They produced the hat found at the scene. They described the shotgun. Bowles denied everything, his voice steady, spinning a tale of mining claims and travel. But then, Hume played the final card. He asked to see Bowles' left hand. The room went silent. Bowles hesitated, his composure cracking for the first time. He slowly unbuttoned his coat and withdrew his hand from his pocket. The wound was raw and festering, the flesh torn by the rifle slug, a jagged, undeniable brand of guilt. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The mining engineer vanished, and the highwayman sat exposed in the gaslight, an old man bleeding in a chair. The legal proceedings were swift, a formality that stripped Bowles of his carefully cultivated persona. He waived a jury trial, understanding that the public spectacle would only deepen his humiliation and perhaps result in a harsher sentence. He pleaded guilty to the single charge of the Funk Hill robbery, a tactical maneuver to avoid prosecution for the dozens of other crimes he had committed. The judge, taking into account his age and his clean record prior to the robbery spree, sentenced him to 6 years in San Quentin. It was a light sentence for a man who had terrorized the state for nearly a decade. But for a man of 54 with a shattered hand and a broken spirit, it was a lifetime. San Quentin in 1884 was a fortress of stone and iron jutting out into the cold waters of the bay, a place where the fog ate into the bones of the inmates. Charles Bowles was processed into the system, stripped of his fine wool suit, his diamond stick pin, and his dignity. He was bathed in lye water, his hair shorn close to his skull, and issued the coarse, striped uniform of a convict. He ceased to be Charles Bolton or Black Bart. He became prisoner number 11046. The cell was a damp stone box that smelled of mildew and unwashed bodies, a stark contrast to the open skies of the high country. The door clanged shut with a finality that echoed in his chest, sealing him into a world of regimented misery. The prison routine was a grinding machine designed to crush individuality. The days were measured by the bells and the whistles, the shuffle of boots on the concrete, the clatter of tin plates in the mess hall. Bowles, despite his age, was initially assigned to the jute mill, a hellish industrial cavern where the air was filled with choking dust that coated the lungs and blinded the eyes. The noise of the looms was deafening, a relentless roar that made thought impossible. He worked the machines with his good hand, his bad hand throbbing in the damp air, his body aching from the repetitive labor. He saw men maimed by the gears, their fingers crushed in a second of inattention, saw the guards beat men for moving too slowly, It was a different kind of war than the one he had fought in Georgia, a war of attrition against the soul. However, Bowles was a survivor, a man of intelligence and adaptability. His education and his calm demeanor soon earned him a transfer from the mill to the prison pharmacy. Here, amidst the bottles of tincture and the smell of carbolic acid, he found a semblance of peace. He worked as a clerk in a dispenser, his meticulous handwriting and his knowledge of chemicals making him an asset to the prison doctor. He was a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, and respectful. He never spoke of his past crimes, never boasted to the other inmates about the empty strongboxes. He moved through the prison like a ghost, observing everything but participating in nothing. He wrote letters to the outside world, careful, polite missives that gave no hint of the rage or the despair that festered beneath the surface. He became a fixture of the institution, the polite old man who handed out the pills. The years in San Quentin aged him rapidly. The dampness of the bay exacerbated his rheumatism until he walked with a permanent stoop, his joints locked in a cage of pain. His eyesight deteriorated further, the world blurring into a gray smudge. He looked in the small mirror in the washroom and saw a stranger, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure with white hair and skin the color of parchment. The gentleman Bandit was dead, buried under the weight of the years and the stone walls. He thought of the mountains often, of the smell of the pine needles and the sound of the wind in the manzanita, memories that were both a comfort and a torture. He knew he would never walk those trails again with the same strength. The iron had finally rusted through. In January of 1888, his sentence was shortened for good behavior. The day of his release was a gray, overcast morning, the bay churning with whitecaps. Bowles walked out of the heavy iron gates, wearing a cheap suit provided by the state and carrying a few dollars in his pocket. He was 58 years old, physically broken, and branded as a felon. The reporters were waiting for him, a pack of jackals hungry for a quote from the famous highwayman. They crowded around him, shouting questions, asking if he would return to a life of crime. Bowles looked at them with tired, dead eyes. "No, gentlemen," he said softly, his voice raspy from the years of silence. "I am through with crime." When asked if he would write more poetry, he replied with a grim finality, "I didn't write poetry, I wrote verse, and I won't write any more." He tried to reintegrate into society, but the notoriety was a shackle he could not break. He moved to a hotel in San Francisco, but the police watched him constantly, shadowing his every move. The Wells Fargo detectives tracked him, waiting for him to slip up. He was a curiosity, a sideshow attraction. People pointed at him in the street, whispering his name. He could not find work. No one would hire the man who had robbed 28 stages. The isolation he felt in the city was worse than the isolation of the cell. He was a man out of time, a relic of a frontier that was rapidly disappearing under the weight of rails and telegraphs. In late February of 1888, he vanished. He checked out of his hotel, leaving his few possessions behind, and simply walked away. The detectives lost his trail in the Central Valley, specifically near the town of Visalia. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him. Sightings were reported for years, a shadow in the Nevada desert, an old man walking the roads of Oregon, a prospector in the Klondike. But none were confirmed. The man known as Black Bart had performed his final disappearing act, stepping off the stage of history and into the void. The reality of his end was likely far from romantic. He was an aging man with no money, bad health, and no friends. He likely wandered into the vast, indifferent wilderness he knew so well, perhaps seeking the anonymity of the mining camps one last time. The winter of 1888 was harsh, the cold unforgiving. It is probable that Charles Bowles, the man who had survived the Civil War and the vigilantes, eventually succumbed to the elements he had battled for so long. He may have died alone in a cheap boarding house under a false name, or frozen to death in a high pass, his body covered by the snow that falls silently on the just and the unjust alike. There were no more poems, no more theatrics, only the cold, hard silence of oblivion. Decades passed. The stagecoaches were replaced by automobiles, the dirt roads paved with asphalt. The legend of Black Bart grew, sanitized and romanticized by dime novels and campfire stories. But the man himself remained missing. Then, on February 28, 1888, the trail reached a hotel in Visalia, California, and stopped. Hume said Wells Fargo tracked him there. The clerk recalled a quiet man who checked in and then was never seen again. No confirmed record of what happened next has ever surfaced. The details were scant, the reason unknowable, but that date became the last known sighting, the last verified line in the story. Everything after it turned to rumor, theories, and shadows, and the silence had claimed him completely. The story of Black Bart ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. He was a man created by the brutality of his times, the violence of the war, the greed of the corporations, the hardness of the land. He had tried to carve out a space for himself using fear and theater, but the system he fought was larger and more patient than he was. The loose thread had been pulled, the act unraveled, and the actor swept off the stage. All that remained were the dusty files in the Wells Fargo archives, the rusted shotgun in a museum, and the lingering image of a flour sack mask staring out from the chaparral, a symbol of a wild, desperate freedom that could not survive the encroaching walls of the modern world. The cell in San Quentin was empty, but the prison of his legacy would hold him forever.